Hi guys, and welcome to the Gentle History Podcast. Tonight you arrive just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint, bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, flow straight into the story. You stand at the edge of a clearing somewhere in colonial America sometime in the winter of 1773, and the cold finds you immediately, not dramatically, not with theatrical blizzards or heroic music swelling in the background. Just a steady, intimate cold that slips under your sleeves and quietly informs you that your modern heating bill has perhaps been underappreciated. Ahead sits a small wooden cabin hunched low beneath dark trees. Smoke curls from the chimney in thin, uncertain threads. The cabin is not picturesque in the way modern holiday cards pretend these places were. There are no glowing windows framed by cheerful wreaths. No neatly stacked cocoa mugs waiting inside. The building looks tired already, and it's only early evening. You walk closer through frozen mud hardened into ridges sharp enough to twist an ankle. The air smells of pine sap, damp bark and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, unseen chickens mutter softly in complaint. A dog lifts its head but decides you're too cold-looking to bark at. The cabin itself is smaller than you expected. That surprises almost everyone. Modern people carry enormous expectations into the past. You imagine history happening in large rooms with generous ceilings, because movies have lied to you repeatedly. In reality, many frontier cabins in 1773 measured barely 16 feet across. Entire families slept, cooked, argued, coughed, and survived in spaces smaller than a modern studio apartment bathroom plus emotional regret. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that many colonial cabins were built rapidly with green timber, meaning freshly cut logs still full of moisture. As those logs dried over months and years, gaps formed between them, letting icy drafts creep through. So even when the walls looked sturdy, winter air still found a way inside. Cold apparently has the determination of a tax collector. You reach the rough-hewn door and notice animal skins nailed along the frame to block wind. Deer hide, mostly. The edges are stiff with frost. Someone has stuffed moss into cracks between the logs. It helps somewhat. Historians still debate how effective these early insulation methods truly were during extreme winters, because first-hand accounts vary wildly between bearable discomfort and the sort of cold that makes your teeth feel haunted. The latch lifts with a dry wooden click. Inside, warmth hits you in layers rather than all at once. First comes the smell. Smoke, wet wool, old ash, rendered animal fat, something stewing slowly in iron cookware. Beneath it all sits the unmistakable scent of human beings trapped together indoors for long winters without modern plumbing. Which, to be fair, you would also smell like after several months of chopping wood in sub-zero weather. The room flickers with firelight, shadows stretch across uneven walls. Every surface seems handmade, because it is. A woman sits near the hearth mending stockings beside a dim tallow candle. Her fingers move automatically despite the fading light. A man near the doorway scrapes mud from boots with slow exhaustion. Two children huddle beneath a shared blanket, their cheeks pink from the fire on one side and pale from the draught on the other. No one wastes movement here. That is one of the first lessons Winter teaches in 1773. Every action costs energy. Every calorie matters. You do not pace dramatically while delivering speeches. You do not wander into the snowy night because you need air. You stay close to warmth whenever possible. The fire dominates the room, though dominates may be too generous. It is less roaring fireplace and more stubborn glowing and negotiation. The hearth is built from rough stone blackened with soot. Iron hooks suspend kettles above orange coals. Sparks snap softly upward. You notice everyone positioning themselves carefully around the heat. Not too close, not too far, like planets orbiting a very small sun. And the cold never truly leaves. That part feels strange to you. Modern heat creates total environments. You press a thermostat and transform entire buildings into artificial summer. Colonial heat does not work that way. In 1773, warmth exists in pockets. Little islands floating in a sea of cold air. Your feet remain chilly almost immediately. The floor beneath you is packed dirt. Sometimes cabins had rough plank flooring, but many did not. Dirt floors held dampness and froze hard during severe winters. You can feel cold radiating upward through your boots. The corners of the room disappear into darkness where frost sometimes forms silently overnight. A quirky little tidbit from the period some families believed sleeping with onions placed around the room could absorb sickness from stale winter air. Whether this worked medically is doubtful. Whether it made the cabin smell even stranger is almost guaranteed. The woman near the fire finally glances toward you, though. In this drifting dream of history, she does not seem surprised by your presence. Perhaps travellers arrive often. Perhaps winter simply teaches people not to waste energy questioning the unusual. She gestures toward a stool near the hearth. You sit gratefully. The heat against your shins feels almost painful after the outdoor cold. Your hands thaw slowly. Pins and needles creep through your fingers. Somewhere overhead, wind brushes against the roof shingles with a sound like dry whispers. Outside, darkness thickens among the trees. You begin noticing the cabin's sounds individually now. Logs settling in the fire, quiet chewing. Someone breathing through a congested nose. A kettle rattling softly before boiling. The occasional crack from frozen timber outside. Entire forests could split during severe cold snaps, trees exploding with noises sharp enough to startle sleeping families awake. No electric hum exists here. No distant engines, no refrigerators buzzing patiently in kitchens. Silence in 1773 is never complete, but it is deeper than anything most modern people experience. And underneath all of it lives constant awareness. Awareness that if the fire dies completely overnight, the room could become dangerously cold before dawn. Awareness that firewood supplies might not last until spring. Awareness that storms can trap families for days. You glance at the stack of split logs near the hearth. Smaller than expected. Again. Everything in history is somehow smaller than expected. Even the beds, which you can just barely see tucked against the wall, look narrow and uneven. Thick blankets lie folded carefully atop them. Every piece of cloth matters. Fabric takes enormous labour to produce. A single wool blanket represents weeks of spinning, weaving, stitching and sheep tending. Nothing here is casual comfort. And yet slowly the cabin begins to feel strangely calm. The firelight softens the hard edges of the room. The children lean sleepily against each other. Snow begins ticking faintly against the roof. Someone adds another log to the hearth, with the seriousness of performing surgery. You realise this entire household revolves around surviving the night. Not thriving, not optimising. Just surviving until morning with fingers intact and lungs still working. And somehow, despite everything most people did, you ease closer to the warmth as frost blooms quietly along the inside corners of the cabin walls, and the long winter night finally settles in around you. The cabin keeps speaking to you long after everyone inside falls quiet. Not loudly. Nothing in this place wastes energy on loudness. Instead, the walls murmur in tiny noises. Wood pops softly as frozen fibres contract. The roof gives occasional sighs beneath gathering snow. Wind presses carefully against the logs as though testing each seam for weakness. and there are weaknesses everywhere. You sit near the hearth watching the fire flatten into glowing embers while the room slowly changes shape around the coming night. Earlier, with supper cooking and people moving, the cabin felt almost lively. Now it becomes something else, smaller somehow, more defensive. The man by the door rises stiffly and checks the wall, chinking again with the rough fingers. Moss clay and scraps of cloth have been packed between the logs. In daylight it probably looked solid enough. At night, with the temperature dropping fast, every tiny opening announces itself. You can actually see one draft moving. It snakes through a gap near the floor, disturbing ash beside the hearth. The cold entering through it feels alive, sharp, intentional. Your ankles immediately regret existing. That is the strange thing about these early cabins. They appear sturdy from a distance. Thick logs, heavy roofs, hand-built confidence. But up close they behave more like complicated wooden baskets holding warmth temporarily hostage. A common historical reality in colonial America was that cabins were often constructed quickly before winter arrived, especially in frontier settlements. Families prioritized speed over perfection because freezing outdoors while carefully aligning architecture was generally considered poor planning. As a result, many homes remained unfinished through their first winters. Some settlers even stretched blankets or animal hides across incomplete walls until spring allowed proper repairs. You imagine modern home inspectors entering this cabin. The poor souls would faint directly into the dirt floor. The woman near the hearth pulls another blanket around her shoulders and continues sewing by firelight alone now that the candle has burned low. Candles were expensive. Everything that produced light required labour. Tallow candles smelled faintly of animal fat when burning, while beeswax candles cost enough to make ordinary families stare at them the way modern people stare at luxury yachts. So darkness arrives early indoors. Your eyes slowly adjust. The cabin's walls reveal themselves more clearly now. The logs are uneven bark stripped away by hand. You notice tool marks everywhere, deep axe cuts, scraped surfaces, tiny imperfections from human effort repeated thousands of times. There is no factory precision here. Every wall carries fingerprints of exhaustion. The ceiling hangs low enough that taller visitors would need to duck around beams blackened by years of smoke. Chimneys in 1773 were temperamental inventions at best. Smoke rarely travelled obediently upward forever. Sometimes it drifted back into the room without warning, especially during storms or shifting winds. Your eyes sting faintly. No one comments on it. People living in cabins like this accepted indoor smoke the way modern people accept annoying phone notifications. Constant, unpleasant, apparently unavoidable. Historians still dispute the long-term health effects of daily smoke exposure in colonial homes, because surviving records rarely separated respiratory illness caused by smoke from illnesses caused by cold, dampness infection, or simple bad luck. Which sounds very academic and calm until you realise everyone was basically breathing campfire indoors for entire winters. Above you hangs bunches of drying herbs tied to rafters. Sage, mint, something bitter you cannot identify. The scents drift gently whenever cold air slips through the roof. A curious little fringe belief circulated through some rural communities that certain herbs hanging above sleeping areas could prevent nightmares brought on by winter spirits. Whether people truly believed this or simply enjoyed pleasant smells in cabins full of damp boots remains unclear. Honestly, both explanations feel reasonable. The children finally shuffle toward the beds along the wall. You notice immediately how strange the beds look compared to modern ones. Shorter, narrower, crowded together. One frame creaks alarmingly before settling still. Straw-filled mattresses sit unevenly beneath heavy quilts, and the placement matters. No bed sits too far from the hearth. In cabins, this small architecture bends around heat. The warmest spots are precious territory. Elderly relatives, infants, or sick family members often claimed places nearest the fire during brutal weather. Everyone else adapted around them. You stretch your hands toward the embers again, Already the warmth fades faster than expected. That surprises you most tonight. You assume fires create stable comfort because modern heating has trained your brain badly. But colonial fires required constant feeding, constant management, constant wood, and wood meant labour, hours and hours of labour. You picture the endless cycle behind every glowing ember in this room. Trees cut in autumn, branches stripped, logs hauled manually, wood split with iron wedges, stacks protected from snow, then carried indoors, armful by armful. One winter could consume entire acres of forest. The man near the hearth kneels to rearrange burning logs with an iron poker. Sparks float upward briefly like orange insects before vanishing into darkness above. He does not build the fire larger. That would waste fuel before midnight. Instead, he manages it carefully, preserving enough heat to last until dawn. You begin realizing how deeply winter transforms human behavior here. Every decision stretches toward tomorrow. Even sleep itself becomes strategic. You hear wind outside, again stronger now. Snow scratches faintly against the cabin walls. Somewhere far off, a tree cracks in the forest with a noise like distant gunfire. Nobody reacts much. You meanwhile nearly leave your soul behind. The dog by the hearth opens one eye in judgment before returning to sleep. Apparently you are the only creature here still emotionally attached to modern comfort. Your gaze drifts toward the door. Heavy wooden planks form its surface, but the edges no longer fit tightly in the frame. Thin lines of darkness show through certain seams. Cold air leaks steadily inward. People in 1773 fought winter constantly, but often in quiet, improvised ways. Rolled cloth at the threshold, extra hides against doors, ash packed into gaps, even furniture pushed strategically against drafty walls. Cabins behaved less like sealed houses and more like temporary agreements with nature, and nature negotiated aggressively. The woman finally sets aside her sewing and rubs stiff fingers together. Her hands are rough from endless washing, spinning, chopping, lifting. Winter cracks skin open around the knuckles until tiny streaks of blood appear beneath fingernails. No fancy hand cream waits nearby. Just animal fat salves if the household is fortunate. You glance upward again and notice frost beginning to form along one roof beam. Delicate crystals spread silently in pale silver patterns. Inside the cabin, that detail settles heavily in your mind. People slept in rooms where frost sometimes formed inches above their faces, and yet they adapted. Humans are astonishing that way. Miserable things become ordinary with enough repetition. Your ancestors survived conditions that would inspire modern hotel guests to demand refunds and post furious reviews online titled, "Extremely Drafty Experience." The children are asleep now beneath the layered blankets. One coughs softly and curls tighter inward. The woman banks the fire lower still. Darkness thickens at the room's edges. You realize no part of the cabin is truly warm except the immediate circle beside the hearth. Beyond that invisible boundary, cold waits patiently in corners, beneath beds along walls. A silent second house built entirely from winter air. You pull your coat tighter around yourself and listen, as the wooden cabin settles deeper into the freezing American night, holding its fragile little pocket of life together, one creaking timber at a time. The fire becomes everyone's evening companion long before it becomes their protection. You notice that now as the cabin drifts deeper into darkness. Nobody rushes through the final tasks of the day. Every movement around the hearth feels practiced, almost ceremonial. The woman hangs a blackened kettle from an iron crane. Steam curls upward, carrying the scent of cabbage, onion, and salt pork. Not exactly the menu of a luxury mountain retreat, but after a day in freezing wind, it smells astonishingly comforting. You inch closer to the heat again without thinking. The hearth draws people the way shorelines draw tired sailors. Not because it is perfectly safe or endlessly generous, but because it is the only thing standing between comfort and suffering. A mainstream historical fact about colonial homes is that the fireplace served as the centre of nearly all domestic life. Cooking, cleaning, sewing tool, Repair candle making, laundry heating, even certain medical treatments happened around the hearth because it provided the only dependable heat source. Entire daily schedules bent around fire management. If the fire failed, the household failed with it. The man crouches low beside the flames, feeding them carefully with split oak, not pine. Pine burns hot and fast, throwing sparks wildly. Oak burns slower, steadier. Frontier families learn their firewood the way modern people learn phone passwords. The smell changes immediately as the fresh log catches. You hear soft crackling, then deeper popping sounds from sap trapped inside the wood. Tiny sparks spiral upward toward the chimney. Some drift back into the room before dying mid-air. No one seems alarmed. That surprises you too. Modern people treat indoor sparks as emergencies requiring frantic arm waving and perhaps an instructional insurance video. But cabins in 1773 lived in constant negotiation with accidental fire. Chimneys caught, roofs ignited, loose embers landed in straw bedding. Entire settlements vanished overnight because one exhausted person fell asleep too early beside a careless flame. And still families depended on fire so completely they could never move far from the danger. The children stir as bowls are handed around. Wooden spoons scrape softly against pottery. You accept a portion yourself. The stew is thick, greasy, heavily salted. It tastes earthy and plain, but warmth spreads through your chest almost immediately. That warmth matters. People in cold climates often consumed enormous amounts of calories during winter, because staying alive required fuel from the inside as much as the outside. A labouring adult might eat quantities that seem shocking today, simply to maintain body heat through endless physical work and freezing nights. You glance toward the stacked woodpile again, smaller now. Every meal costs firewood. Every cup of warm broth costs firewood. Every brief moment of comfort slowly transforms forests into ash. Outside, snow taps gently against the cabin roof. Wind slides through the trees with a low whispering sound that rises and falls like distant breathing. Inside, the hearth glows brighter as the room darkens further around it. You begin noticing how firelight changes people's faces. Features soften, shadows deepen around tired eyes. Everyone looks older beside a hearth at night, more ancient somehow. The woman lifts a kettle lid and briefly fills the cabin with steam. Moisture beads against the cold walls before disappearing again. Even tiny changes in temperature become visible here. A quirky little colonial practice involved preserving hot coals overnight beneath thick layers of ash. Families called this banking the fire. If done properly enough, heat remained hidden beneath the grey powder to restart flames by morning. If done badly, everyone woke to frozen misery and the humiliating task of begging neighbours for fresh embers. Imagine knocking on someone's cabin at dawn, basically asking, "Hello, we failed at fire." Historians continue arguing over how widespread certain fire-saving methods truly were in isolated settlements, especially among poorer families with limited wood supplies. Some records suggest meticulous nighttime fire management, while others describe people simply letting flames die entirely to conserve fuel. Either way, nobody sleeps carelessly around a hearth. The man demonstrates this now without explaining it. He shifts logs inward, breaks apart collapsing wood with a poker, spreads embers evenly, everything deliberate. You realise fire in 1773 is less about creating heat and more about maintaining balance. Too much fire wastes precious wood. Too little fire invites dangerous cold. Too much smoke suffocates the room. Too little draft kills the flames. There is no thermostat. No backup furnace waiting quietly in the basement. Just constant human attention. The dog rises, suddenly circles twice beside the hearth, then collapses again with dramatic satisfaction. Honestly, the dog may understand thermal strategy better than anyone else here. You watch shadows flicker across the low ceiling beams. Smoke gathers faintly above before disappearing into the chimney. Not all of it escapes. Your clothes already smell permanently seasoned by wood smoke. Colonial travellers often carried that scent everywhere during winter months. Smoke embedded itself into fabric blankets, hareskin. Entire communities probably smelled faintly like campfires and damp wool from November through March. Strangely, the scent becomes comforting after a while. The children finish eating and curl together beneath blankets near the wall. One of them holds a warmed stone wrapped in cloth against their chest. The stone came from beside the hearth. Primitive, simple, effective enough. You think about your own bedtime routines back home, adjusting pillows, maybe checking your phone one last time, complaining that one foot feels slightly colder than the other. Meanwhile, here people prepare for sleep like small military operations against weather. The woman stands carefully and hangs damp stockings near the fire to dry. Ice had formed around their edges earlier from tracked snow. Wet fabric in winter becomes dangerous quickly. Frostbite does not care whether you are fashionable. A gust of wind rattles the chimney suddenly. Smoke spills briefly into the room. Everyone pauses automatically. The fire dims, then recovers. No panic follows, only experience. You notice how calmly people here respond to discomfort, because discomfort arrives constantly. Tiny hardships no longer deserve emotional energy. Smoke in the eyes, cold feet, aching backs, drafts against the neck. These things form the wallpaper of daily life, and through it all the fire keeps time. Without electric lighting, evenings grow naturally shorter in winter. Most families slept longer during colder months simply because darkness arrived early, and maintaining candles cost money. The hearth became the final glowing clock before bed. You stare into the embers longer than intended. There is something hypnotic about old firelight. Maybe human brains still remember thousands of years spent sleeping beside flames. Maybe part of you relaxes because your ancestors survived this way for so long. Or maybe you are just very tired from mentally carrying imaginary colonial firewood all evening. The man finally lowers the room into nighttime arrangement. Larger flames disappear. Smaller coals remain glowing beneath settling ash. The cabin cools almost immediately around the edges. That speed shocks you again. Warmth here is temporary by nature. The woman wraps another shawl around herself before climbing carefully into bed beside the children. The man stays awake longer, watching the fire in silence. You understand why. Tonight's sleep depends entirely on those last red embers surviving until dawn. Outside, the winter forest deepens into darkness beyond imagination. Inside, the tiny cabin gathers tightly around its fading circle of heat, while you sit listening to wood settle softly into ash, realizing how every colonial evening ended with the same quiet question. Will the fire last until morning? Smoke drafts and frost settle into the cabin as if they have been invited politely and then refused to leave. The fire is lower now, no longer bright enough to rule the room with confidence. It glows in red pockets beneath grey ash, breathing softly whenever the chimney pulls. The cabin's corners grow darker. The air above your head thickens with a faint blue haze. It smells sharp, woody, greasy, and old, as though every meal, every winter, every damp sleeve has left a ghost behind. You sit very still and begin to understand that warmth is not the only thing people share in a cabin like this. They share smoke. They share dampness. They share breath. They share the slow discomfort of a room that is never quite sealed, never quite clean, never quite safe. The chimney gives a low, hollow sound as wind moves across its top. A brief ribbon of smoke rolls backward into the room. It curls along the beam, spreads thinly, then lowers just enough to make your eyes water. Nobody rises. No one says, well, this is unacceptable. In 1773, the complaint department is a cold forest. Early American chimneys often drew poorly, especially when built from rough stone clay sticks, or whatever material a household could manage. A well-made chimney could improve indoor air greatly, but many cabins had smoky interiors through winter. The hearth gave heat, yes, but it also filled rooms with soot that blackened rafters coated cookware and worked its way into lungs. You blink slowly, your eyelids sting. Across the room, one child turns in sleep and coughs once into the blanket. The sound is small, ordinary, almost swallowed by the room. The woman opens her eyes, immediately listens, then closes them again. Mothers in every century seem to sleep with one part of the mind still standing guard. It is impressive and, frankly, a little terrifying. A pale draught touches your cheek. You look toward the wall and see where it enters. The packed clay between two logs has shrunk slightly, leaving a narrow black line. When the wind rises outside, that line breathes inward. Snow dust has gathered along the sill beneath it, delicate as flour. Inside snow, a design feature no real estate listing mentions. You imagine someone in a modern rental discovering snow inside the bedroom. There would be messages, there would be photos, there would be phrases like "not livable" and "urgent maintenance request." Here someone will likely press more moss into the gap tomorrow and continue existing. Some rural families used mixtures of mud, straw, moss, lime animal hair, and even scraps of worn textile to chink cabin walls. The exact recipe varied by region and what was available. What mattered was blocking wind. Perfect insulation was not the dream. Reduced suffering was the dream. A humble ambition, but very fashionable in the 18th century. A lesser-known belief in some households held that a smoky room could help preserve hanging meat or discourage insects hiding in rafters. There was practical truth in smoke curing, of course, but whether ordinary cabin smoke was considered a helpful household ally or simply tolerated misery depended on place season and personality. You can almost hear one exhausted settler insisting, "The smoke keeps pests away," while everyone else quietly cries into their wool. Researchers still disagree about how often cabins in backcountry America remained heavily smoked through the night, because surviving descriptions come from travelers' officials, ministers and later memoirists, all of whom noticed different things, and sometimes exaggerated for effect. One visitor's filthy, smoky hut might be another family's perfectly normal Tuesday. The fire gives a sudden snap. A spark lands on the hearthstone and dies. The room returns to quiet. You begin to sense how the cabin changes by height. Near the dirt floor, cold gathers like invisible water. At waist level, the air is tolerable near the hearth and unpleasant everywhere else. Above, warmth and smoke collect beneath the rafters. The cabin is not one temperature. It is a stack of different climates piled in the same room, which feels ambitious for a building made mostly from trees and stubbornness. Your feet ache from the cold, your face feels warm from the embers, your eyes sting from smoke, your back notices the draft. Your body receives 4 weather reports at once. The woman shifts beneath her blankets and pulls a nightcap lower over her ears. That small gesture says more than a lecture. Heat escapes quickly from uncovered skin, and people knew from experience that covering the head mattered during cold sleep. Wool caps, linen caps, scarves, shawls, and even extra cloth wrapped around the neck could help a person keep enough warmth to make it through the darkest hours. The man remains awake, sitting upright near the hearth with his hands folded. He watches the embers as if they are livestock that might wander off. Outside, the wind strengthens. The door creaks faintly in its frame. The threshold cloth lift settles, lifts again. You can hear the cabin working. Logs creak. Pegs complain. Something on the roof shifts under snow. The sound is intimate, almost like being inside the ribs of a sleeping animal. And yet there is comfort in the noise too. A silent cabin might mean the fire has died. It might mean the wind has buried the door. It might mean the world outside is too frozen even to move. These little sounds, annoying as they are, prove that the house is still resisting. You run your fingers along your sleeve and feel soot already settling into the fabric. If you lived here, every garment would carry traces of nights like this. Smoke would season your coat. Frost would stiffen your hem. Wool would absorb the smell of stew sweat animals and ash. Clothing did not simply cover the body. It recorded the household. Another draft slips across the room. This one smells different. Colder. Cleaner. It carries pine and snow, a bright scent from outside that cuts through the heavy smoke for just a moment. You breathe it in, then regret it because it chills your throat. The children sleep on. The dog twitches beside the hearth, chasing some warmer dream. Perhaps a summer rabbit. Perhaps a magical 18th century sausage that never runs out. One can hope. The fire sinks lower. Now the frost becomes visible near the window opening where oiled paper or thin horn panes blur the night beyond. Glass exists in colonial America, of course, but it is costly and not guaranteed in a simple cabin. Many frontier windows are small because every opening is a leak. Light is welcome during the day. At night, glass or no glass windows become cold mouths. A thin white lace creeps along the inner edge. Frost is beautiful when you are not responsible for surviving beside it. You find yourself staring at those crystals, watching them grow in silence. They form slowly, patiently, with more confidence than anything human built in the room. The cabin resists winter with logs, mud, cloth, ash, and muscle. Winter answers with chemistry. The man finally rises. He takes the poker and gently covers the brightest coals with ash, not killing them, only quieting them. The act feels tender, almost parental. The room darkens another shade. You understand now that nobody expects the cabin to defeat the night. That would be absurd. The cabin only has to delay the cold long enough for bodies under blankets to keep breathing until dawn. So you settle deeper into your borrowed warmth, listening to smoke-thickened draughts wander and frost bloom in the hidden seams of the small wooden room. The cold follows you even into bed. That is the truth nobody puts into cheerful colonial paintings. You watch the household prepare for sleep, and slowly it becomes clear that clothing matters just as much as firewood. Perhaps more. The hearth can warm only part of the room. Your clothes stay with you through every draught, every midnight, awakening every miserable trip outdoors before dawn. In this cabin, fabric is survival stitched by hand. The woman rises again from the bed and checks the children's blankets with sleepy precision. One scarf is tightened. A wool cap is pulled lower. She tucks loose fabric beneath small shoulders the way modern parents might check charging cables or night lights. Only here forgetting something can cost fingers. You look down at your own clothes and suddenly feel embarrassingly underprepared. Modern winter wear is designed for brief outdoor exposure between heated buildings. Colonial clothing had a much harsher assignment. People in 1773 often wore several layers indoors and slept in many of them too, especially during severe winters. Linen shifts beneath wool gowns, wool stockings beneath heavier wraps, caps, neckcloths, shawls, mittens when necessary. Even then, warmth remained uncertain. One practical detail from the era surprises many historians of domestic life. Linen was frequently worn closest to the skin because it absorbed sweat and oils more effectively than wool. Wool insulated better, but linen protected the expensive outer layers from grime. Laundry itself was exhausting work in winter, especially when water froze rapidly outdoors, so preserving garments mattered enormously. You flex your fingers near the dying embers and notice how the woman layers her own clothing before settling down fully. Her nightwear is not loose and romantic like something from a historical drama, where everyone somehow has perfect teeth and emotional lighting. No, this is tactical dressing. She wears a long linen shift wool stockings, layered petticoats, and a knitted cap that covers nearly all her hair. The man removes only part of his outer clothing before lying down near the wall. Boots remain close at hand in case someone must rise quickly, and honestly that makes sense. Imagine needing to stumble through a freezing cabin at midnight searching for boots while your feet scream in protest against a dirt floor cold enough to refrigerate butter. You notice the children sleeping almost cocooned beneath layers of wool and patched quilts. Their breathing fogs faintly in the colder corners of the room. The fire has faded again, and already the cabin feels sharper around the edges. Heat leaves quickly. Bodies try desperately to keep it. A curious practice from some rural households involved sleeping with heated bricks wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed. Stones work to especially smooth river rocks warmed beside the hearth. The trick required care, of course. Overheated stones occasionally scorched blankets or cracked dramatically. Nothing ruins a peaceful winter evening quite like your bed exploding gently near your ankles. Outside wind presses against the cabin with slow persistence. Inside, fabric rustles softly as everyone adjusts themselves toward comfort that never quite arrives. You begin noticing textures now. Coarse wool scratching skin, rough linen creasing at elbows, thick seams pressing against shoulders when someone turns in bed. Colonial clothing was handmade or locally produced in ways that prioritized durability over softness. Fancy imported fabrics existed for wealthier families, certainly, but frontier cabins dealt mostly in practicality. Softness was a luxury. Warmth was the prize. Researchers continued discussing how much imported textile trade truly improved winter comfort for ordinary colonial households by the early 1770s. Some evidence suggests rising access to woven goods in certain regions, while other records paint a harsher picture of patched garments reused until they nearly dissolved into threads. The truth likely depended on location harvest, wealth and luck. You hear the man cough quietly into his sleeve. Smoke again? Everything returns eventually to smoke-cold dampness and labour. The woman reaches beneath the blankets and pulls out something small, a little cloth pouch. She rubs it between her hands briefly before placing it near one child's chest. Lavender perhaps, or dried mint. Some families tucked herbs into bedding not only for scent, but because certain plants were believed to calm nerves, ease sickness or protect sleepers from troubling dreams. Winter nights in isolated cabins stretched long and black beyond the walls. A little pleasant smell may have felt like civilization itself. The dog sighs heavily beside the hearth. Its position is strategic genius. Half near the embers, half tucked against an old blanket. You suspect if dogs could lecture humans in 1773, most advice would simply be lie closer to warm thing. And honestly fair. You glance upward toward the ceiling beams again. Smoke still hangs there in thin layers. The warmest air remains trapped near the roof, wasted above sleeping bodies. Some cabins later experimented with loft sleeping spaces, partly because rising heat gathered overhead, though lofts brought their own problems. You'll discover those unpleasant surprises soon enough. For now, everyone stays low. The man finally lies down fully dressed except for outer coat and boots. That catches your attention. Sleeping clothed seems uncomfortable to modern instincts trained by central heating and soft mattresses. But in bitter weather, removing layers meant surrendering warmth your body had already worked hard to build. Besides, mornings in 1773 are cold enough to inspire despair before breakfast. Nobody wants to begin the day by putting frozen clothes back onto warm skin. The fire settles deeper into ash. Darkness thickens, and yet the room does not feel entirely hopeless. There is resilience here. Quiet expertise. These people know exactly how to arrange blankets, fold sleeves, layer wool, preserve warmth between bodies. Knowledge passed through winters one after another. You realize survival in cabins like this depended less on heroic endurance and more on countless tiny habits. Wrap the scarf before sleeping. Keep stockings dry. Warm stones slowly. Cover the head. Save the thickest quilt for the youngest child. Bank the fire carefully. Do not waste movement. Do not waste heat. The cabin itself may leak cold from every seam, but the people inside have adapted around those weaknesses like water finding paths through stone. A sudden gust rattles the wall hard enough to shake loose a little dust from the rafters. One child murmurs in sleep and pulls closer to the woman. Without waking fully, she drapes an arm over both children automatically. You sit beside the final embers and notice your own shoulders curling inward against the cold now spreading steadily through the room. Your breath appears faintly in front of you. Inside the cabin. Again! And still nobody panics, because this is normal here. Normal is sleeping in layered wool while frost gathers beside the window. Normal is waking to numb fingers. Normal is treating blankets like treasure. You pull your coat tighter and listen to the soft rustle of fabric, the whisper of smoke overhead, and the long, patient breathing of people wrapped carefully inside their own handmade shelter against the winter dark. The beds look heavier than the rest of the room. Not elegant, not soft in the modern sense, just heavy. dense with labour fabric, feathers, straw, and years of winter survival packed into narrow wooden frames. You move closer carefully, trying not to wake anyone, and the scent reaches you first. Dry grass from straw ticking, old wool, smoke embedded deep into quilts, a faint earthy smell from linen aired too rarely during frozen months. Colonial bedding was not decorative background scenery. It was one of the household's most valuable possessions. In some probate inventories from 18th century America, bedding appears listed with striking importance because blankets, featherbeds, sheets, and quilts represented enormous investments of time and resources. Good feather mattress could cost more than several pieces of furniture combined, which makes sense the moment you touch one. You press a hand lightly against the nearest mattress and feel uneven softness beneath rough linen. Feathers shift slowly inside, not luxurious exactly, but warmer than plain straw alone. Beneath it sits another layer stuffed with dried plant material. Corn husks sometimes, straw more often. Everything rustles quietly. The frame creaks beneath sleeping weight, and despite all the blankets piled above it, cold still lingers near the edges. That part surprises you less now. You're beginning to understand that winter in 1773 never disappears completely indoors. It only retreats temporarily from concentrated effort. The bed is not a paradise of comfort. It is a carefully constructed defense position. The woman sleeping beside the children barely moves except to pull the quilt higher now and then. You notice how everyone sleeps tucked inward, tightly, knees bent, shoulders curled. People conserve heat instinctively during cold nights, folding themselves into smaller shapes like resting animals. Honestly, the entire cabin increasingly resembles a group survival experiment run by determined blankets. One little-known custom in some colonial households involved warming bed linens before sleep, by placing heated objects between the sheets briefly, then removing them before lying down. Wealthier homes sometimes use metal bed warmers filled with coals. Simpler cabins relied on wrapped stones, heated bricks, or bottles filled with warm liquid. Of course, accidents happened occasionally. A scorched blanket in winter was not merely annoying. It was the kind of mistake that could ruin an entire season. You glance toward the foot of one bed and spot a smooth stone wrapped carefully in cloth. Still faintly warm, the children cling unconsciously toward it in sleep. A fascinating detail preserved in household records from the 18th century is how frequently families repaired bedding rather than replacing it. Quilts were patched repeatedly. Feather beds were restuffed. Blankets were resewn at corners until fabric thinned, almost transparent. Textiles demanded too much labour to discard casually. A single blanket represented spinning, weaving, dyeing, sewing sheep, raising, washing, and endless maintenance. You suddenly feel guilty for every blanket you have ever ignored in the back of a closet. The fire sinks lower again. Now the cabin exists mostly in red shadow. You can still hear the wind outside, not violent tonight, just persistent. Snow brushes softly across the roof in little dragging whispers. Occasionally something taps the outer wall, branches perhaps, or frozen debris blown loose through the trees. The sound travels clearly because the cabin itself is never silent. Wood settles constantly. Beds creak faintly when sleepers shift. Someone breathes through a blocked nose. Ash collapses softly inside the hearth. You notice another detail now. The beds are crowded close together. Privacy exists differently here. Entire families often shared sleeping spaces out of necessity, warmth, or simple lack of room. Children piled together, guests squeezed wherever space allowed. Travellers sometimes shared beds with complete strangers at inns during winter journeys, which must have created some deeply awkward historical conversations. "Good evening, sir. Lovely frost tonight. Kindly stop stealing the blanket." Some researchers continue examining whether shared sleeping arrangements primarily reflected economic necessity, or whether communal sleeping simply felt culturally normal to many colonial families. Probably both. When surviving the night matters more than personal space, warmth wins arguments quickly. The dog rises and circles once before collapsing beside the children's bed, now pressing against the lower blankets. No one pushes it away. A warm dog is a useful object in winter. Perhaps that sounds unromantic to modern ears, but frontier life had little patience for pretending practicality and affection were separate things. Animals slept indoors partly because families loved them, and partly because freezing livestock represented financial disaster. Even cats earn their keep twice over. Mice love grain stores and warm bedding. Cats loved mice. History continues peacefully. You sit beside the nearest bed frame and run your fingers across the quilt stitching. Tiny uneven hand-sewn lines cross the fabric in faded patterns. Every stitch required candlelight patience and time stolen from exhausting days. The quilt itself tells a story without words. Different scraps reveal older garments cut apart and reused. One patch may once have been a shirt, another part of a child's worn dress. Fabric survives longer when transformed. The cabin smells warmer near the beds than near the door. Not hotter exactly, just fuller with trapped human heat. Breathing bodies slowly change the air. You understand now why people slept packed closely during winter. Several bodies beneath layered blankets create something dangerously close to comfort. Dangerously close. Not quite there. Your toes remain cold. A draught still brushes the wall. The room still tastes faintly of smoke, but compared to outside this little nest of blankets and breathing feels miraculous. A scholarly disagreement still lingers over how much featherbedding improved actual winter warmth in drafty cabins versus simply increasing comfort perception. Some surviving accounts praise featherbeds enthusiastically, while others complain they trap dampness or compressed badly over time. Human beings, it turns out, have argued about mattresses forever. You hear the man shift heavily near the hearth. He has not truly fallen asleep yet. One arm remains stretched toward the dying fire, as though maintaining contact with the room's last reliable heat source. Perhaps he worries the embers will fade too far before dawn. Perhaps he simply cannot relax fully during winter. You understand that feeling already. The cabin teaches vigilance quietly. Every sensation matters. Cold fingertips, smoke direction, wind strength, blanket thickness, fire level. Tiny details decide whether a night becomes uncomfortable or dangerous. And still there is tenderness here too. The woman murmurs something softly in sleep when one child whimpers from a dream. Her hand pats the blanket twice without waking fully. The child settles instantly. Outside, the forest remains black beyond imagination. Inside, these patched quilts and crowded beds form a fragile little island against it. You lean back slowly and watch the embers pulse faintly in the hearth, while feather beds rustle blankets rise and fall with sleepy breathing, and the long freezing night presses patiently against the cabin walls. Warmth belongs to the group now. You can feel that truth before anyone says it, because nobody here sleeps as an island. The beds, the blankets, the hearth, the dog, the bundled children, the weary adults, even the shape of the room itself all lean toward one lesson. In a freezing cabin, privacy is lovely in theory and rather useless when your toes are losing negotiations with the night. The family has arranged itself by need. The smallest children are tucked between warmer bodies where drifting cold has a harder time reaching them. The woman lies near the edge but keeps one arm across the blankets, holding the little cluster together without waking. The man rests closer to the hearth, not because he's indulging in comfort, but because someone must rise if the fire needs tending. His sleep is lighter. His position is duty disguised as warmth. You watch this quiet arrangement and realize that the cabin has a social map. The warmest places are not random. They're assigned by age, weakness, illness, labor rank, and love. An infant might sleep closest to the mother. A sick grandmother might claim a spot near the hearth. A hired hand might sleep on a bench or pallet near the door where the draft slips in first and manners matter less than hierarchy. Household inventories and diaries from the 18th century often show that beds were shared widely, especially in poorer homes and temporary lodgings. Parents, children, apprentices, Servants, visiting kin and travellers could all occupy the same sleeping space or the same room. Separate bedrooms were a sign of means not an everyday guarantee. Comfort was communal because architecture had not yet become generous. You shift slightly on your stool and hear the floor crunch faintly beneath your boot. Packed earth holds the cold like memory. The draft near the door touches your calves again, and you understand why nobody wants that sleeping position. The person nearest the door receives winter first. Every gust, every leak, every little blade of air slipping through wood seams and threshold cloth. Somebody always pays that price. Tonight it seems to be an older boy, perhaps 12 or 13, curled beneath a thin blanket near a storage chest. He sleeps deeply, one arm thrown over his face. His blanket is patched and narrow. His feet are tucked into wool stockings, still damp at the toes despite time near the hearth. Childhood in this room is not quite the protected world modern people imagine. Children work, children carry wood, children fetch water, children share bedding, children learn cold as a daily teacher. Not cruelly necessarily, just constantly. A small odd custom found in parts of early American life involved letting visiting travellers sleep in the family room without much ceremony, sometimes even sharing bedding, if weather made refusal dangerous. Hospitality carried practical urgency. Turning someone away in deep winter could mean sending them into real peril. So yes, an exhausted stranger might receive floor space, a blanket, and perhaps the privilege of hearing your entire family snore in historical surround sound. The dog sighs again, proving that at least one creature is thriving. It has chosen a place between hearth warmth and child warmth, which may be the finest strategic decision made in the cabin all night. One child's foot rests against its side. The dog does not object. Heat is heat. You notice how bodies influence the room. Near the beds, the air feels faintly warmer and more humid. Breath rises beneath blankets and catches under fabric. People sleeping close together create a fragile climate of their own. Not enough to defeat the cabin cold, but enough to soften it. Shared sleep becomes a technology older than tools and more reliable than a poor chimney. There is no embarrassment in it here. Modern people often treat sleeping arrangements as intensely private, tangled with ideas of personal space, comfort, and status. In this room, the body is simply another source of warmth, another participant in survival. Everyone already knows what everyone smells like. The cabin has no secrets left. It has been winter for too long. Some historians question how much emotional intimacy we should read into shared colonial sleeping arrangements, since practical necessity often overruled preference. A crowded bed might signal closeness, poverty convenient social duty, or simply that the alternative was freezing alone. The past resists tidy answers, very rude of it, honestly. The woman stirs and shifts one child closer to the centre of the bedding. She does it in sleep. That motion feels ancient, protective without thought. Human hands have made that same movement in caves, tents, longhouses, ships, cottages, cabins, and apartments, when the room turned cold and the child beside them needed covering. Outside, the wind fades for a moment. The sudden quiet feels deeper than the noise. You hear breathing everywhere. Slow, adult breathing. Lighter child breathing. The soft puff of the dog. The faint wheeze of someone congested from smoke and winter air. The cabin seems filled with small rhythms, all of them keeping time with the embers. The fire is nearly hidden now beneath ash, but its glow still survives. The man opens his eyes. Only briefly. He lifts his head, checks the hearth, listens to the wind, then settles again. That tiny movement explains the entire night. Sleep in 1773 is not always a full surrender. It is an agreement to rest while remaining ready. A neighbour might knock at dawn for coals. A child might wake coughing. A cow might break loose. Snow might block the door. A roof might leak, an ember might stray. The world does not pause respectfully because people are tired. You glance toward the corner where storage sacks are stacked beneath a hanging hide. Grain-dried beans, perhaps meal. Food shares the room too. Tools lean nearby. A musket rests within reach. Clothing hangs from pegs. The cabin is bedroom, kitchen, workshop, pantry, nursery, sick room, and shelter all at once. Nothing is separate. The lack of separation changes sleep. There is no quiet hallway leading to private rooms, no door to close against family noise, no soft mattress sealed inside clean white walls. There is only the shared human nest, smoky and draughty, and patched together with need. And yet a peculiar tenderness grows from that crowding. You see it in the way blankets overlap, in the careful placement of the warm stone near the children, in the man sleeping near the fire so others can stay buried beneath covers, in the older boy taking the colder pallet without complaint, or perhaps with complaints made earlier and ignored by history. The cabin gathers its sleepers like a hand closing around embers. Another small sound comes from outside. A scrape against the wall. Everyone remains asleep except you and perhaps the dog whose ears lift slightly. After a moment, nothing follows. Snow sliding from a branch maybe, or some animal passing close by. The dog lowers its head again, deciding civilization is not currently worth defending. Good dog. The room cools further. You feel it settling on your shoulders. The kind of cold that does not arrive all at once but accumulates patiently like dust. Your fingers stiffen, your nose chills, your thoughts slow. You finally understand why the family sleeps as one warm arrangement rather than scattered individuals. Because the cabin is too small for modern loneliness. Because fabric is precious. Because firewood is finite. Because winter does not respect privacy. And because through these long freezing nights one body beside another can become the simplest form of mercy. The warm stone near the children has become the room's quiet treasure. You notice it again as the night settles deeper, wrapped in cloth and tucked close to small feet beneath the blankets. It gives no light. It makes no sound. It has no romance about it whatsoever, which is usually how you know something in history is genuinely useful. A simple stone heated beside the hearth becomes portable comfort. Not much comfort, perhaps. Not the dreamy abundance of a heated mattress pad. Not the absurd luxury of climbing into sheets already warmed by electricity. Not that modern miracle where your bed seems to forgive every bad decision you made during the day, but enough. Enough to soften the first shock of bedding. Enough to help toes uncurl. Enough to make sleep possible. The woman rises once more, moving slowly so she does not disturb the children. She takes another stone from beside the hearth. With a folded rag, tests it carefully against her wrist, then wraps it tighter. Her movements are exact. Too hot and it can scorch cloth or skin. Too cool and it is only a disappointing rock with ambitions. People in the 18th century commonly use bed warmers, hot stones, bricks, or bottles to take the worst chill from bedding before sleep. Wealthier households might own a brass or copper warming pan with a long handle filled with coals and slid between sheets. In smaller cabins, warmed stones and bricks did the work cheaply. The principle was beautifully plain. Move heat from the fire to the bed before the bed steals heat from you. You watch her slide the wrapped stone near the man's side of the bedding. He murmurs thanks without opening his eyes. The exchange is tiny, but it feels tender. So much of winter care is hidden in gestures like this. Someone dries stockings. Someone mends a tear before it widens. Someone remembers which child kicks off blankets. Someone tests a stone so another person is not burned in the dark. The cabin survives through these small acts repeated until they become invisible. A less familiar habit mentioned in some domestic traditions was rubbing cold feet briskly before bed to bring feeling back into them, sometimes with animal fat salve, if the skin had cracked from cold. It sounds unpleasantly practical because it was. In a room where damp stockings and freezing floors were normal hazards, feet became a household concern. Modern skincare would like to have a word, but it has arrived about 200 years too late. The man reaches toward the hearth and adjusts his nightcap. The cap is plain wool, close-fitting, pulled low over the ears. Beside him, the woman's linen cap has a wool scarf wrapped over it. The children wear knitted caps too, though one has slipped sideways in sleep, giving the child the appearance of a very tiny, exhausted philosopher. Nightcaps were not comic accessories in this world. They mattered. Covering the head helped preserve warmth, especially in cabins where air near the face could grow painfully cold before dawn. People understood this from experience, long before modern charts explained heat loss with neat little diagrams. You can almost hear a colonial grandmother saying, "Put on your cap," with the same grave authority later generations would use for seatbelts. There is an ongoing argument among material culture historians about how much surviving clothing evidence reflects ordinary rural life, since preserved garments often belong to wealthier families or special occasions. Everyday wool caps, patched stockings, plain bedgowns and worn wraps were used until they nearly vanished, leaving fewer examples behind. The objects most needed by ordinary people are often the ones least likely to survive. The past inconveniently did not save all its receipts. You look toward a peg near the wall where bedgowns hang in soft shadow. Loose wool garments, practical, easy to pull over other clothing, useful for sitting near the hearth before sleep or rising before dawn into air sharp enough to punish ambition. The woman takes one and drapes it across the older boy near the draughty side of the room. He does not wake. The fabric settles over him like a quiet apology for the cold place he's been given. Outside, a gust passes through the trees. It arrives first as a low sound, then presses against the cabin. The doorcloth lifts. The fire murmurs under ash. Smoke shifts overhead. Everyone's bedding seems to tighten instinctively. You feel your own shoulders rise. That is how the cold works here. Not as one dramatic event, but as constant pressure. Every object must help resist it. Caps, stones, stockings, shawls, quilts, dogs, ash, moss, doors, bodies. The whole cabin is a committee meeting against winter, and winter has opinions. A small iron kettle sits near the hearth, no longer boiling but still warm. Earlier it held water for washing, maybe tea, maybe broth. Warm liquids before sleep could help, though nobody here treats them as indulgence. Everything warm is useful. Everything useful is measured. You imagine modern bedtime rituals alongside this one. Lavender sprays, white noise machines, weighted blankets ordered with reviews and discount codes. Here the ritual is older and rougher. Test the ember. Wrap the stone. Tie the cap. Tuck the child. Pull the shawl. Listen to the wind. It is not glamorous, it is effective enough. The dog, not wishing to be left out of civilization's progress, wedges itself more firmly against the bedding. One child's hand rests on its fur. Warm living, faintly smoky fur. This may be the finest blanket in the room, though it snores. The fire collapses slightly under ash, revealing a hidden red glow. For a moment the cabin brightens from below. The walls appear again. The patched quilts, the stacked wood, the hanging herbs, the frost at the window, the sleeping faces arranged around warmth as carefully as objects on a table. Then the glow dims. You notice how slowly everyone breathes now. Sleep has taken most of the room, yet the night's preparations remain visible everywhere. Stockings hung near the hearth, boots turned inward so snowmelt does not freeze inside them, a shawl laid within reach, the poker close enough for the man to stir coals without rising fully. Even rest is organized. The woman finally lies down again. Before closing her eyes, she touches the wrapped stone near the children's feet, checks the cap on the smallest child, and presses the quilt edge beneath the mattress. She has done this perhaps hundreds of times before. Her hands know winter. An unusual belief in some communities held that placing certain herbs near the bed could sweeten dreams or protect against night fears. Practical or not, the scent of dried mint, sage, or lavender would have mattered in a smoky room. A little sweetness beside the pillow can feel like defiance. You breathe in. There it is, faint beneath smoke and wool. A green smell, soft, fragile, almost gone. The cabin is still cold. The walls still leak, the fire still fades, but these small preparations have changed the night. They have made it bearable, perhaps even calm. You settle deeper into the hush as warmed stones cool slowly beneath blankets, nightcaps hold in precious heat, and every humble object in the room quietly joins the work of keeping sleep alive until morning. The hearth becomes the centre of the night again, not because it is bright now, it is hardly bright at all. The fire has withdrawn into itself a buried red pulse under grey ash, like some small animal breathing beneath snow. Yet every sleeping body still seems arranged around it. Even in darkness, the room points toward the hearth. You feel its pull. Your knees angle toward it. Your hands drift closer without permission. Your face turns toward the faint glow because some older part of the body understands fire before the mind explains it. The man sleeps nearest to it, though not comfortably. He rests on a low pallet, half wrapped in a blanket, one arm close to the hearthstone. This is not the privileged spot it might first appear to be. Yes, he receives slightly more heat than the others, but he also receives spark smoke ash and the responsibility of waking when the coals need tending. Warmth comes with chores. History is very consistent about that. In many 18th century cabins, the hearth was the practical heart of the household, and sleeping near it was often reserved for those who needed to manage the fire or those most vulnerable to cold. The arrangement could change from night to night. A sick child, an elderly parent, a newborn, or a visitor chilled from travel might be moved closer to the embers. The fire decided social geography as much as furniture did. You watch the man stir slightly. His eyes open. For a moment he does not move. He listens first. That seems to be the habit here. Before action, listening. Wind, roof, breathing, animals, fire. Only after the room has been judged safe does he reach for the iron poker. He shifts ash gently aside. A red glow wakes beneath it. The cabin brightens by a breath. He adds one small piece of wood no larger than his forearm. Not enough to build a proper flame, only enough to keep the ember alive. The log catches slowly whispering before it crackles. Smoke rises, hesitates, then finds the chimney. You feel the heat revive against your shins. Not much, but enough to remind the room that morning is still possible. There was an old practice called keeping a hearth alive, meaning preserving coals from one day into the next instead of starting from cold each morning. Flint and steel existed, of course, and many households could make fire, but relighting from living embers saved time and effort. In deep winter, that saved effort mattered. A glowing coal could mean warm food, sooner thawed fingers sooner, and fewer miserable minutes kneeling in darkness, trying to coax sparks from tinder, while everyone silently judges you. A strange little belief travelled through some communities that letting a household fire die completely invited misfortune, not merely inconvenience. Fire had symbolic importance as well as practical value. A living hearth could represent household continuity, safety, and divine favour. Now, whether every tired farmer truly felt mystical about embers at 3 a.m. is another matter. Sometimes a coal is sacred. Sometimes it is just the thing keeping your socks from becoming wooden. The man covers the new flame again before it grows too hungry. The room dims. He lies back down. You notice the placement of the beds again. None sits directly beside the flames. That would be dangerous. Bedding catches easily, especially straw ticks, feather mattresses, loose wool, and hanging cloth. A family had to be close enough to benefit from heat, but far enough to avoid disaster. The hearth is comfort and threat in the same stone mouth. People knew this intimately. Children were warned not to tumble too near it. Clothes were dried at cautious distances. Cradles were placed with care. Everyone understood that fire could save a household all winter and destroy it in minutes. This tension gives the room a special quiet. Not fear exactly, more like respect. Modern heat hides its danger inside vents and wiring and invisible systems. Here warmth is openly alive. It snaps, glows, breathes, eats, and occasionally spits. You cannot forget what it is. The dog does not forget either. It has crept closer now, nose pointed toward the ember glow pores tucked beneath its body. Its fur catches a faint red outline. One ear twitches whenever wood pops. You feel the room's temperature improve slightly near the floor, then fade again as the small flame disappears beneath ash. Heat moves strangely in this cabin. Close to the hearth, skin warms almost too much. A few steps away, cold waits exactly where you left it. It is like borrowing comfort by the inch. In debates over early American domestic life, some historians question whether written descriptions of hearthside warmth romanticize what was actually a smoky, cramped, uneven experience. Later nostalgia often turned the colonial fireplace into a symbol of family unity and wholesome simplicity. The lived reality was probably more complicated, full of coughing ash, sweeping burned hems, and children arguing over who stole the warmer side of the blanket. Still, you understand why memory softened it. At night, with darkness gathered outside and the ember glow breathing softly, the hearth does feel like a kind of promise. A poor promise, perhaps, but a promise. The woman murmurs in sleep. The youngest child turns toward her. The older boy near the draught curls more tightly beneath the added bedgown. The dog exhales. The cabin seems to settle around these sounds. You hear the man's breathing slow again. His short wakefulness has passed, but it has changed everything. The coal is stronger now. It may last another hour. Perhaps 2. Perhaps until grey light begins to seep through the cracks. The night becomes measurable in embers. Not minutes. Not clocks. Embers. How long since the last stirring? How deep the ash cover? How much wood remains beside the hearth? Whether the coal still glows when the poker touches it? These are the hours by which a winter cabin sleeps. You wonder what time it is. Then realize time matters differently here. The sky outside is black, the fire is low, the bodies are still warm enough. That is the clock. A faint smell rises as the new wood smoulders. Oak, smoke, dust, ash. It joins the older smells already layered in the room. Wool, bodies, stew, damp leather. Herbs, dog. Cold has a smell too, though less direct. It arrives as sharpness behind everything else, a clean edge under the smoke. You inhale slowly. The air is uncomfortable but deeply real. The cabin is not pretending to be cozy for an audience. It is simply doing what it can. Again and again tonight that phrase returns. Doing what it can. The walls do what they can against wind. The blankets do what they can against frost. The people do what they can against exhaustion. The hearth does what it can against a whole continent of winter. And somehow all of it together is enough. Not enough for ease. Enough for survival. You sit close to the hearth as the little coal glows beneath its blanket of ash, and the room gathers around it in silence, each sleeper, trusting that this guarded red heart will still be alive when morning finally comes. At some point in the night your attention drifts upward, not toward the stars. You cannot see those from inside this little cabin. Your gaze climbs instead toward the dark space above the rafters, where the ceiling disappears into shadow and smoke. The loft waits there. You noticed it earlier, only faintly, a low platform built beneath the roofline. Now in the weak ember glow it becomes clearer. Rough planks stretch above part of the room, supported by beams blackened from years of smoke. A ladder leans nearby, worn smooth by boots and bare feet. The loft is where heat goes, at least in theory. Warm air rises, carrying smoke with it. In a cabin this small, the upper space can feel noticeably warmer during winter nights. That makes the loft valuable territory, especially when temperatures collapse below freezing outdoors. But warmth in old cabins is rarely simple. The older boy finally wakes enough to climb upward. You hear the ladder creak beneath him. He carries a blanket over one shoulder and moves with sleepy familiarity, ducking his head beneath the low beams. A little puff of dust drifts down from above. You watch him disappear into darkness near the roof where the smoke hangs thickest. There it is. The bargain. The loft offers warmer air but also stale air. Smoke, dust, roof drafts, splinters, sometimes insects, occasionally leaks. Colonial sleeping spaces loved offering comfort with one hand and misery with the other, very balanced of them. Archaeological studies and surviving cabin descriptions suggest lofts were common additions in many frontier homes, particularly where families needed more sleeping space, without expanding the footprint of the cabin itself. A loft could hold children's storage, drying herbs, tools, or extra bedding. In winter, the trapped rising heat made it appealing despite the smoke and cramped conditions. You imagine modern fire safety inspectors witnessing children sleeping directly above an open hearth in a smoky wooden room and immediately ascending into the heavens from stress alone. The boy settles overhead with a soft rustle of blankets. From below, you can hear him coughing lightly once or twice before growing still again. The smoke collects near the rafters in thin, shifting layers. You notice it more clearly now that you're watching for it. The upper beams look lacquered in soot. Years of tiny particles have darkened every surface. The smell changes too. Closer to the floor, the cabin smells earthy and cold. Above, the air thickens with smoke-dry timber, old dust, and heated pine resin from the roof itself. Warmth carries its own scent. An unusual little practice from some regions involved hanging strips of meat herbs or damp clothing near loft spaces, because the rising heat and smoke could help dry or preserve them. Imagine trying to sleep while someone's onions and socks hover nearby in the darkness like strange historical decorations. You hear faint movement overhead again. The loft ceiling is so low that no adult could stand fully upright there. The roof slopes inward sharply. During storms, snow sometimes pushed cold moisture through weak shingles or gaps in the boards. In warmer months, insects found their way inside easily. Yet during bitter winter nights, people still climbed upwards seeking trapped heat. Human beings are astonishingly willing to sleep in inconvenient places if those places are 4 degrees warmer. The man near the hearth shifts again and rubs one hand across his face. The ember glow catches deep lines around his eyes. Winter work ages people quickly here. Chopping wood, hauling water, breaking ice, repairing leaks, carrying feed. Every task costs strength, and winter demands them all while daylight remains short and fingers go numb halfway through. The woman remains asleep, though lightly. One child has rolled partly free of the blankets. Without waking fully, she pulls the quilt back into place. The room is dim enough now that shapes blur at the edges. Only the hearth gives definition. The rest feels suspended between dream and darkness. You think about the loft above, about sleeping close to smoke every night. Medical historians still dispute how severe long-term respiratory damage may have been in constantly smoky homes, because evidence is scattered and tangled with many other hardships of colonial life. Cold air, poor nutrition, dampness, disease, and endless labour all affected the body at once. Isolating smoke alone becomes difficult, yet nobody doubts people inhale tremendous amounts of it. You feel your own throat dry just sitting here. The roof creaks overhead, snow shifting perhaps, or ice tightening against the shingles. The sound rolls through the cabin softly, almost like a boat settling on water. You begin to understand how deeply weather entered these homes. Modern houses shield people from nature so completely that rain becomes background noise. Here every gust announces itself personally. The loft responds first. Wind touches the roof. Roof touches beams. Beams whisper through the whole structure. You hear the boy move again above, pulling blankets tighter. A draft must have found him. That is another truth of loft sleeping. Warm air rises, yes, but so does danger. Roof gaps let in snow. Chimney sparks sometimes drift upward. Heat dries wood until everything smells faintly combustible. During storms, people lying in lofts could hear every complaint the roof wished to make. Still, families kept climbing those ladders, because warmth matters more than convenience. A frontier saying from later generations claimed that children sleeping in lofts grew hardy. This may simply be historical language, for everyone was cold, and we tried to sound cheerful about it. The dog suddenly lifts its head. Its ears twitch toward the outer wall. You listen to... There it is again. A scraping sound outside, long, slow, then silence. Probably a branch dragged by wind. Perhaps an animal nosing around the cabin edge. Winter forests remain busy even at night. Foxes, deer, raccoons, stray dogs, occasionally worse things. The dog watches the darkness a moment longer, then relaxes again. Apparently civilization survives another hour. You lean back against the wall near the hearth. The wood behind you feels cool despite the fire only a few feet away. That contrast never stops feeling strange. Warm face, cold spine, smoke overhead, frozen floor below. The cabin contains several seasons simultaneously. You glance upward once more toward the loft. The boy is quiet now, perhaps asleep, perhaps simply conserving warmth by remaining still. In winter, cabins' movement wastes heat almost as quickly as open doors. The embers settle lower again, ash shifts softly inward, and the loft above continues holding its small pocket of trapped warmth beneath the roof while smoke curls through the beams, and sleepers drift carefully through another freezing American night, suspended between cold below and cold above. The cold enters from below first. You feel it creeping over the floor long before you notice anything else changing in the room. The embers still glow faintly. The blankets still rise and fall with sleeping breath. The roof still mutters softly beneath the weight of snow. Yet under all of it, another presence slowly spreads. Floor cold, threshold cold, door crack cold. It slips through the cabin, patiently touching boots, chair legs, bedposts, blanket edges. You can almost imagine it pouring inward like invisible water. The draft near the doorway grows sharper. A thin strip of cloth has been pushed against the threshold to block it, but the wind keeps finding tiny openings anyway. Colonial cabins often leaked from the lowest points first, because settling logs warped door frames and widened gaps over time. Dirt floors made the problem worse. Frost gathered easily along edges where frozen ground met warmer indoor air, creating little streams of cold that wandered through the room all night. You stare toward the door now. It looks sturdy enough at a glance. Thick wooden planks, iron latch, heavy hinges, but the lower corners no longer sit flush in the frame. Darkness shows through in little crooked seams. When the wind presses harder outside, those seams breathe inward. The older boy downstairs pulls his blanket tighter without waking fully. His sleeping place near the draft has become steadily colder over the last hour. You can tell by the way he curls tighter into himself, knees drawn upward, shoulders tucked inward. Human bodies shrink around cold instinctively. The dog notices too. It abandons its earlier position and relocates closer to the hearth by exactly 6 inches. A masterclass in thermal engineering. You quietly respect the professionalism. In many 18th century cabins, families used whatever materials they could find to reduce drafts along floors and doorways. Rolled cloth, bundled straw animal hides, packed earth, moss, and even old clothing might be pressed into cracks. Perfection was impossible. Improvement was enough. A cabin did not need to feel cozy by modern standards. It merely needed to stop the wind from biting too deeply while people slept. That difference matters. Modern homes promise comfort. This cabin promises endurance. You glance down at the floor again. Frost glitters faintly along one edge where moonlight seeps through the door crack. Tiny crystals have formed near the threshold cloth itself. You can imagine what stepping barefoot onto that surface would feel like. Actually, no. Your mind rejects the thought immediately. Wise choice. A strange winter superstition in some isolated communities warned against sweeping a cabin floor after dark during severe weather, because it might sweep out the household's warmth or luck. Practical people likely ignored such ideas when dirt and ash piled too deeply, but during long winters, rituals and caution often blended together. When survival depends on fragile systems, people become reluctant to tempt fate unnecessarily. The room has cooled enough now that you see everyone's breath again, only faintly, little pale ghosts drifting upward in the emberlight. The woman wakes briefly and sits up halfway beneath the blankets, not from noise, from temperature. Her body has noticed the room changing. She reaches automatically toward the youngest child, pulling another layer across small shoulders before lying back down. That movement says everything. No speech, no complaint, just adjustment. There is a quiet rhythm to surviving cold nights: wake, pull blanket, check ember, curl tighter, sleep again. You begin to understand why people in earlier centuries often slept in stages during winter, drifting in and out of a lighter sleep rather than sinking into uninterrupted rest. The room itself demanded attention. Fire needed watching. Bodies needed covering. Strange sounds outside needed judging. Sleep became a conversation with the environment instead of a sealed escape from it. Some historical researchers continue discussing how frequently colonial families woke during the night, compared to modern sleepers, particularly during winter months, with long darkness and uneven indoor temperatures. Diaries and records suggest segmented sleep patterns may have been more common than people once assumed. Then again, if your bedroom occasionally develops indoor frost, uninterrupted sleep may simply become an ambitious dream. The wind rises again outside. This time the cabin answers with a long creaking complaint from the wall nearest the forest. Snow dust sifts softly down from one roof beam. The older boy in the loft coughs once overhead. You hear something else too now. The chimney pulling harder. A low hollow sound passes through it as colder air feeds the draught. The embers brighten briefly beneath ash. Heat and cold wrestle invisibly through the stone throat of the fireplace. Your fingers ache slightly. Not painfully yet, just stiff enough to remind you the room is winning slowly. You rub your hands together and notice how dry the air feels near the hearth, despite all the damp boots and wet wool. Fire steals moisture from everything nearby. Skin cracks, lips split, wood shrinks. Blankets stiffen around the edges where frost and heat alternate over many nights. A lesser-known household trick involved hanging thicker fabric or spare quilts near doors during severe weather to create a kind of primitive cold barrier. Wealthier homes might manage heavier curtains. Poorer cabins improvised with whatever cloth existed. It rarely stopped the drafts completely, but even slowing the cold mattered. The family here has done exactly that. You notice now an old wool blanket hanging beside the doorway, stiff with age and smoke. It sways slightly whenever wind sneaks through the cracks. The movement is almost hypnotic, back and forth, slowly, like the cabin breathing. The fire sinks lower again. The man opens his eyes immediately this time. He does not even lift his head at first. He watches the embers for several long seconds, calculating perhaps how much wood remains, how much night remains, how much cold the cabin can tolerate before dawn. Then he rises carefully. The floor must feel brutal against his feet, even through wool stockings, but he makes no sound except the soft scrape of the poker against stone. He feeds the fire another small piece of wood, not large, never large. Every log spent tonight will not exist tomorrow. That arithmetic follows everyone through winter. The little flame catches, slowly sending a warm orange flicker across the room. Frost near the doorway glows briefly before fading again into shadow. You realize something quietly astonishing. Nobody here expects perfection. Nobody demands total comfort. The cabin leaks. The floor freezes. The door breathes cold air. Smoke stings the eyes. Blankets slip loose. The loft coughs dust downward. Yet the family keeps adjusting around these flaws instead of imagining they can eliminate them entirely. There is wisdom in that, perhaps. Or exhaustion, probably both. You settle deeper against the wall. As wind crawls under the doorway once more, the floor radiates its stored winter upward into the room, and the little wooden cabin continues its long uneven struggle to hold warmth together until morning. The smell of food lingers long after supper's ended. It hangs low near the hearth, thick and savoury, woven into smoke and wool and the faint dampness of drying stockings. Salt pork, cabbage, onion, cornmeal perhaps. The kind of meal that does not sparkle in a cookbook photo but settles into the body like a small promise. You understand now why it matters. Food is not merely comfort here. It is heat waiting to happen. The cabin has grown colder again, and yet the sleepers remain tucked beneath blankets with the stubborn patience of people who know their own bodies are working quietly in the dark. Beneath wool and linen, beneath quilts and caps, hearts beat. Blood moves. Breath warms tiny pockets of air. Digestion continues its slow hidden labour. A person in this room survives the freezing night not only by the fire outside the body but by the fire inside. Colonial winter diets often leaned heavily on preserved foods, salted meat, dried beans, cornmeal root vegetables, hard cheese apples stored in cellars, and whatever could be smoked, dried, pickled, or kept from spoiling. Fresh greens were scarce in many regions during deep winter. Calories mattered more than variety. A full belly helped a person endure cold labour and the long hours before dawn. You remember the stew from earlier, thick, greasy, simple, it makes more sense now. Fat is warmth with patience. Salted pork bear, fat butter lard sweet and dripping all had practical value in cold climates. They provided energy, dense fuel for people who spent daylight splitting wood, carrying water, tending animals and walking through snow. Modern listeners may politely request a salad after hearing this, and that is understandable. But a salad will not help you haul frozen logs before sunrise. The man near the hearth shifts in his sleep and presses one hand against his stomach, as if the meal still sits there reassuring him. His body knows what it has received. Heavy food before sleep may not sound elegant, but winter rarely rewards elegance. There is an old household habit found in many cold places of giving children something warm before bed when supplies allowed. Broth, porridge, milk if the animal cooperated, cider warmed by the hearth. Not dessert exactly, more like a thermal investment. A warm cup could carry comfort from the mouth down into the chest, making the first hour of sleep less punishing. You can almost feel it again in memory, that stew spreading outward through your ribs. A curious notion in some 18th century domestic medicine held that certain warming spices such as ginger pepper or nutmeg could strengthen the body against cold humours or winter weakness. These spices were not always cheap, so ordinary cabins used them sparingly if they had them at all. Still, the idea that food could warm the body in moral, medical and emotional ways had deep roots. Also, let us be honest, anything that made boiled cabbage more exciting deserved philosophical support. The wind outside presses hard against the walls then fades. Inside the food smells have softened into memory. You notice the storage area again, sacks and crocks tucked into the corner away from the worst damp. Survival in winter begins months before the freezing night. Autumn butchering, harvest drying, bean shelling, corn grinding, apple storing, cheese making, candle rendering. Every preserved bite tonight comes from earlier labour. Winter sleep depends on summer work. That's one of those quiet truths history likes to hide under blankets. Experts in early American foodways still wrestle with how sharply winter diets varied between regions, classes and communities in 1773. A coastal household might have fish, molasses, tea and trade goods. A backcountry family might rely more on corn, pork, game and stored roots. Enslaved people, servants, indigenous communities and settlers all experienced cold weather food in profoundly different ways. There is no single colonial menu, however much museums may enjoy arranging one neat table. This cabin is plain, though not entirely desperate. The family has enough to eat tonight. That alone changes everything. Hunger makes cold crueler. You sense that instinctively. A body without enough food struggles to make heat. Hands numb faster. Sleep becomes lighter. Mood darkens. Work feels heavier the next day, which makes gathering fuel harder, which makes the next night colder. Hardship can loop around itself like that, tightening quietly. But tonight the children sleep with supper in their bellies. Their cheeks, though pale in the draught, keep a little colour. The youngest child breathes steadily against the woman's shoulder. The older boy in the loft has gone quiet again, perhaps finally warmed by the trapped air above. The dog snores with absolute faith in the universe. Near the hearth sits a small covered pot. Leftovers, perhaps. Tomorrow's breakfast base. Nothing wasted. Bones simmered for broth, grease saved, crumbs gathered, ashes used, rinds boiled. Even stale bread could be toasted, soaked, or broken into soup. Food waste in this room would feel almost immoral, not because anyone gives a lecture about sustainability, but because every scrap carries labour. Someone grew it, fed it, hunted it, chopped it, salted it, stirred it, guarded it from mice and counted it against the remaining weeks of winter. You glance at the musket near the wall. Hunting could supplement stores, but winter game was uncertain and powder cost money. A deer could help a household enormously. A failed hunt could cost precious daylight and energy. The forest offered food, but never on command. Very inconsiderate of nature, really. Considerate of the cabin's interior smells of animal fat because fat enters almost everything. It seasons pans, enriches food, softens leather burns in lamps, protects cracked skin, and occasionally waterproofs what needs protecting. In a world without packaged convenience, fat is multi-purpose technology. The tallow candle stump near the hearth proves the point. Even light comes from rendered animal matter. Its scent remains faintly in the air, waxy and meaty, not unpleasant exactly, just deeply 18th century. You listen as the room settles again. Cold at the door, smoke above, food warmth inside bodies. This is the invisible triangle of the night. The fire alone cannot do it. The blankets alone cannot do it. Clothing alone cannot do it. Supper alone cannot do it. Survival comes from stacking small advantages until the night becomes bearable. A full stomach, a wool cap, a banked coal, a shared blanket, a dog with good judgment. History often tells us about battles and declarations, but this too is history. A spoon scraped clean, a child given the warmer portion, a mother saving grease in a crock, a father counting the woodpile and the meal barrel with the same worried eyes. You feel the cold return around your ankles, but now you understand the quiet heat beneath the blankets. Each sleeper carries the evening meal into the dark as surely as the hearth carries embers under ash. Outside snow keeps falling without drama. Inside the cabin rests on stored summer-salted autumn, and one plain supper still glowing softly in the bodies that sleep through the freezing night. By the time true night settles over the cabin, you begin to understand why sleep comes at all. It is not because the room is comfortable. It is not because the bed is soft. It is certainly not because the air smells fresh, unless fresh now means smoke wool, tallow, damp boots, old stew dog fur, and a mysterious corner scent that everyone has wisely chosen not to investigate. Sleep comes because the body has been worked nearly empty. The people under these blankets are not drifting off after a relaxed evening. They are collapsing quietly after a day that began before sunrise and demanded strength from the first breath. Winter in 1773 does not allow much idleness for ordinary households. Even staying alive requires chores enough to fill every hour of pale daylight. You imagine the day that led to this room. Before morning fully brightened, someone rose into freezing air and stirred the hearth from hidden coals. Someone carried water from a spring well or stream, perhaps breaking ice first with a stick or axe. Someone fed animals before the feed froze solid. Someone chopped wood, hauled wood, stacked wood, counted wood, worried about wood. Always wood. The 18th century could have been renamed the Age of Carrying Logs, and nobody would have complained except historians with branding concerns. Hard physical labour shaped winter sleep in ways modern people can hardly feel. Chopping fuel, grinding grain, lifting water, tending livestock, repairing fences, spinning thread, mending clothes, and cooking over an open hearth burned enormous energy. A person could lie down cold and uncomfortable, yet still sleep because exhaustion pressed heavier than any blanket. You look toward the man near the hearth. His hands tell the story even in sleep. Knuckles swollen, nails darkened by soot and dirt, skin cracked across the joints, one wrist wrapped in a strip of cloth. He probably swung an axe earlier until his shoulders burned, then carried logs through snow, then repaired some outdoor thing that should have waited until spring but rudely refused. The woman's hands are no less tired. They rest near the children now, but earlier they mended stockings, stirred food, lifted kettles, checked bedding, handled fire, perhaps spun thread, perhaps washed, perhaps scraped frozen mud from clothing. Domestic work in cabins was not light work because someone wrote it indoors. Indoors simply meant the smoke was closer. The children too have earned sleep. Even small children carried kindling, watched younger siblings, fetched water in lighter pails, gathered eggs, shook bedding, or helped with animals. Childhood still existed, of course. There was play, teasing curiosity, little jokes whispered under quilts. But winter made usefulness arrive early. A small, rather charming custom in some families was giving children little indoor tasks near the hearth. During long winter evenings such as shelling beans, winding thread, sorting scraps, or carding wool. It kept small hands busy and close to warmth. It also prevented the delightful historic activity known as children becoming bored in a one-room cabin during a storm which may have tested adult patience more severely than the weather itself. You hear a faint sound overhead from the loft. The older boy shifts and the boards creak softly. Then stillness again. He has likely slept hard from the moment his body allowed it. A day spent outdoors in winter can make even a smoky loft feel like paradise. Not a good paradise, perhaps. More like paradise operated by a committee with limited funds. Outside the forest is still busy in subtle ways. Snow settles from branches. Ice tightens around bark. Somewhere beyond the cabin an animal moves through brush with soft snapping sounds. But inside the human world has withdrawn completely into rest. That rest is earned. You feel it in the room, a deep heaviness beneath the breathing. Those who study early American daily life still differ over how to measure the toll of ordinary labour, since account books and diaries often mention tasks without describing the ache, chill, hunger, boredom and repetition behind them. A line that says cut wood may hide 6 hours of cold hands, slipping boots, numb ears, and a back that complains long after dark. Records are tidy. Bodies were not. The fire clicks softly. You think again of the wood pile. Every log warming the cabin tonight had to be cut before it became comfort. Every ember is yesterday's blister. Every spoonful of supper is someone's harvest hunt preservation and hauling. The bed itself is work made visible. Straw gathered, feathers saved, cloth woven, quilt stitched. Even sleep is supported by labour stacked layer on layer. It changes how you see the room. Nothing here is merely an object. The kettle is carried iron. The blanket is spun time. The candle is rendered fat. The floor is packed earth shaped by feet. The cabin is trees turned into shelter by human strain. No wonder everyone sleeps when they finally can. The woman exhales slowly and shifts one shoulder away from a draught. Her face is softened by sleep now, though even asleep she seems slightly alert. Years of winter nights have probably trained her to wake at any cough spark cry or change in wind. That kind of rest is never complete. It is sleep with one ear open. Sleep with responsibilities waiting at the edge of dreams. A colonial household did not divide sharply between workday and night, the way modern schedules pretend to do. Fire might need tending, animals might need checking, a child might need comfort, a storm might demand emergency repairs. The boundary between labour and rest was thin, especially in winter. You notice your own body growing heavy just from watching. The slow ember glow, the steady breathing, the wind repeating itself against the wall, the faint smell of warm ash. It all begins to blur at the edges, lulling you even though the floor remains cold and the smoke still scratches faintly at your throat. Maybe this is how exhaustion becomes mercy, not comfort. Mercy! The body, having done everything required, simply lowers itself beneath blankets and takes whatever sleep winter permits. There is dignity in that. Not grand dignity, not statue dignity, a smaller kind, the kind found in continuing. In waking while it is dark, in hauling water when the handle freezes to your glove, in chopping wood because children will sleep under that heat later, in mending one more stocking by failing light, in eating plain food, thankfully, in lying down fully clothed because tomorrow will ask again. The dog dreams beside the hearth, paws twitching. Perhaps it worked too, guarding following warning, stealing warmth with expert timing. Every member of the household contributes according to talent. The dog's talent appears to be warmth management and emotional support, both admirable. The ember dims, then pulses. You feel the room breathing around it. The sleepers do not need perfect silence. They do not need softness. They do not need warmth in the modern sense. They need enough safety, enough food, enough covering, and enough fatigue to carry them through the coldest hours. And so they sleep, deeply unevenly bundled in smoke-scented cloth, their bodies tired enough to make peace with the hard floor, the cramped bed, the draught at the door, and the long frozen night still waiting outside. Something moves outside the shutters. Not loudly. Just enough. A faint scrape through snow. A pause. Then another soft sound against the outer wall of the cabin. The kind of noise modern people might ignore in a heated suburban house, while continuing to scroll through glowing screens under 3 blankets and a scented candle named Winter Orchard. Here every sound matters. The dog hears it first. Its head rises slowly from beside the hearth, ears forward, eyes open but calm, not panic. Assessment. You suddenly understand why animals were such important companions in isolated cabins. A dog notices trouble before humans do. Sometimes before trouble notices itself. The man near the embers wakes instantly. Not fully upright, not dramatic. Just awake in one smooth movement, eyes fixed toward the door. That alertness feels ancient. You realize people sleeping in frontier cabins could never entirely surrender to the night. Too many things existed beyond the walls. Storms, predators, wandering livestock, travellers, drunken strangers, falling branches, fire, illness. The wilderness surrounding early settlements was not empty space. It pressed constantly against the edges of life. The scraping comes again. The dog gives a low sound deep in its throat, not barking yet, just informing the room that the world continues. Many frontier families kept muskets or rifles within reach during the night. Not necessarily because attacks were constant, but because isolation demanded readiness. Firearms protected livestock, hunted food, warned away predators, and offered reassurance in lonely country. In a small cabin, the musket often rested near the hearth, or beside the doorway where it could be reached quickly if needed. You glance toward the wall. There it is, long barrel wooden stock silent in shadow. The man listens another moment, then relaxes slightly. The dog lowers its head halfway, though not completely. Whatever moved outside has probably passed along. Probably. That word carries more weight out here. The forest surrounding the cabin is enormous in the nighttime imagination. Even if only a few yards of trees stand beyond the clearing, darkness stretches them into infinity. Snow absorbs sound strangely too. Some noises arrive, muffled and close. Others travel sharply across frozen air from impossible distances. A branch cracks somewhere far away. The sound echoes like splitting stone. One child stirs beneath the blankets but does not wake. You realize how much courage ordinary winter nights required in isolated places. Not heroic battlefield courage, quieter than that. The courage to hear strange sounds in darkness and continue living anyway. To sleep while knowing the walls are thin and the nearest neighbour may be miles away through snow. A curious belief persisted in certain rural communities that whistling outdoors at night during winter might attract wandering spirits or bad luck. Whether anyone truly believed this or simply wished people would stop making eerie noises in frozen forests after dark is difficult to know. Honestly, both positions seem reasonable. The fire shifts softly. The room glows red again for a moment. You imagine how vulnerable the cabin truly is. One room, one door, one chimney, one family sleeping close together inside rough timber walls. Modern houses disguise fragility behind layers of engineering. This cabin does not pretend. It survives through constant attention and a bit of luck. Outside, wind moves through the trees again. You can hear individual branches brushing together high above the roof. Dry wood against dry wood, a sound like old bones tapping politely. The older boy coughs from the loft. The woman murmurs something in her sleep and turns slightly toward the children. Even asleep, the family shifts instinctively toward one another whenever strange noises arrive. Bodies gather closer in uncertainty. Some specialists studying frontier settlements continue debating how isolated ordinary families truly felt during winter months. Certain regions maintained strong community networks despite harsh conditions, while others endured long stretches with little contact beyond the immediate household. Distance behaved differently before railroads, telephones, or reliable winter roads. A few miles through snow and forest could become an entirely separate world. You think about that. No emergency number exists here. No quick doctor. No snowplow clearing paths before sunrise. If something serious happens tonight, the cabin faces it mostly alone. The dog lifts its head again suddenly. This time the sound comes from the roof. A slow sliding rush. Snow shifting downward. You feel your own muscles tense before the sound fades harmlessly away. The man exhales softly through his nose. False alarm. Still, nobody fully relaxes immediately afterward. Winter trains caution into the body through repetition. One dangerous storm, one fallen tree, one wolf near livestock, one chimney, spark in dry timber, and the lesson stays forever. A faint, icy draught slips across the room again. You pull your coat tighter. The fire is lower now than ever before tonight. Mostly embers, mostly memory. Yet the room still clings to its little pocket of warmth. The sleepers remain cocooned beneath layered quilts. Breath rises steadily. The cabin holds. That matters. You notice the shutters now barely visible near the window opening. Thick wooden boards fastened against the night. Glass windows existed in colonial America certainly, but shutters added another layer against windstorms and fear itself. Closing them changed the psychological shape of the room. Outside became hidden, contained, or perhaps merely postponed. A smaller sound drifts through the wall again. Tiny claws, perhaps. Mice. Of course, mice. Winter drives creatures inward just as surely as humans. Cabins stored food, cloth straw, and warmth. Mice considered this excellent hospitality. The dog ignores them. Professional courtesy, perhaps. You smile despite yourself. Even fear here becomes ordinary with enough exposure. The family no longer wakes for every creak or scratching sound because they cannot afford to. Imagine surviving winter while reacting dramatically every time a mouse investigated your beans. You would perish from exhaustion before Christmas. The musket remains untouched by the wall. The dog settles again. The man closes his eyes once more, though lighter than before, and the cabin continues listening. That is what strikes you most tonight. The room never truly sleeps. Even in rest, it listens outward through timber walls and shutter cracks toward the frozen darkness beyond. Every creak matters. Every gust announces itself. Every scrape outside enters the dreams of the people within. Yet somehow this constant awareness does not make the cabin feel hopeless. Only human. Fragile, yes. Exposed, certainly. But human beings have always slept beside uncertainty. Storms outside tents, wolves beyond campfires, waves against ships, strange footsteps in alleys, winter pressing against walls. The little cabin listens, breathes, waits, and endures. And after a while, so do you. You sit quietly beside the fading hearth while wind drifts through the trees, unseen creatures move through the snowy dark beyond the shutters, and the family sleeps in cautious trust that the thin wooden walls around them will hold until dawn. The coughing begins quietly. Just one sound at first, a rough little catch from the loft above quickly swallowed into silence, then another from the woman near the children. Then the older boy by the draughty wall clears his throat in his sleep without fully waking. The cabin listens and answers with smoke. You sit near the embers and suddenly become aware of the air itself. Thick, dry near the hearth, damp near the walls, smoky everywhere in between. Winter sickness thrives in places like this, not because people are careless, but because survival forces bodies into difficult bargains. Warmth versus fresh air, shared heat versus shared illness, open drafts versus closed rooms. The family has chosen warmth tonight as most would. That choice makes perfect sense until you breathe deeply. Colonial cabins during winter often trapped smoke, moisture and human breath inside, enclosed spaces for long stretches, especially during storms or severe cold. Respiratory illnesses spread easily under such conditions. Coughs, fevers, sore throats, and lung infections were common companions of winter life, particularly among children and older adults whose bodies struggled most against smoke and cold combined. You glance toward the youngest child. One small hand sticks partly free of the blanket, now pink from warmth at the fingertips, but pale farther up the wrist where the room air reaches it. The child breathes steadily, though with a faint congestion you can hear once you begin listening for it. The woman wakes again, not fully, only enough to press the back of her fingers against the child's forehead in practiced darkness. Mothers in this century do not own thermometers, they own instinct and worry. Apparently that remains true across time. She adjusts the blanket once more and settles back. Near the hearth a kettle still hangs above faint heat. If someone worsens during the night, warm water will matter quickly. Tea if there is tea, broth if there is broth, steam if nothing else. You notice bundles of dried herbs hanging from a beam again. Sage, mint, something sharp smelling beneath the smoke. Many households relied on herbal remedies during winter illness because professional doctors were distant, expensive, or simply unavailable. Mint teas, mustard plasters, onion syrups, vinegar tonics, and heated poultices all appeared in household medicine traditions. Some worked modestly, some likely comforted more than cured. Some probably tasted like punishment disguised as healthcare. A peculiar remedy recorded in certain regions involved placing sliced onions in sleeping rooms to absorb sickness from the air. Whether the onions accomplished anything medically is doubtful, but they certainly ensured the cabin smelled aggressively committed to recovery. The fire shifts softly. Ash collapses inward. You feel the room cooling another degree. Cold itself weakens people here. Wet feet remain wet too long. Damp blankets dry poorly. Drafts creep beneath clothing. Exhaustion lowers resistance. One difficult week can slide into illness before anyone fully notices. And yet people continue. That part humbles you. They continue hauling wood while coughing. Continue cooking while feverish. Continue tending children while barely rested themselves. The modern fantasy of perfect recovery under soft blankets with endless soup delivery and streaming entertainment does not exist here. Winter chores wait for nobody. Cows still need feeding even if you feel terrible. Medical historians still discuss how much mortality in colonial winters came directly from infectious disease versus the compounding effects of cold smoke exposure, malnutrition and exhaustion weakening the body over time. The categories blur together. A cough in a warm, dry, modern house is one thing. A cough in a smoky, freezing cabin after months of labour is another creature entirely. The older boy in the loft coughs again. Longer this time. Dust drifts faintly downward between the rafters. The loft air must be thick tonight. Warm perhaps, but stale. You imagine him breathing smoke and dust beneath the low roof while trying to sleep through winter congestion. Not ideal. The dog sneezes suddenly. Even the dog sounds tired of the air quality. You smile faintly despite yourself. The woman reaches slowly toward a small crock near the bedside and rubs something onto her hands. Animal fat, perhaps. Herbal salve. Her knuckles looked cracked earlier. Winter skin splits painfully in these conditions. Hands bleed around the nails. Lips crack. Faces chap from cold wind outside and dry heat inside. No scented lotions arrive from charming little bottles. Only grease herbs, patience, and surviving until spring. You hear the wind soften outdoors. The cabin grows quieter. Without stronger gusts pressing smoke downward, the chimney draws a little better now. The air clears slightly near the floor. You notice the difference immediately. Smoke no longer scratches the throat quite so sharply. That tiny improvement feels luxurious. People in these cabins became experts at reading air. Which direction smoke moved, whether dampness lingered too heavily, whether a child's cough sounded dangerous, whether frost near the walls meant worsening drafts. They had to notice these things because the room itself could help or harm them depending on conditions. A lesser-known winter practice involved airing bedding outdoors on clear cold days whenever possible, even during winter. Blankets, ticks, and linens absorbed smoke, dampness, sweat, and insects over time. Fresh freezing air helped somewhat, though hauling heavy bedding outside into snow probably felt like a cruel form of exercise invented by hostile ancestors. You shift closer to the hearth again. Your own throat feels dry now, eyes slightly irritated. You realise how impossible it would be to remain truly healthy through an entire winter without some physical toll. Smoke enters the lungs daily. Cold enters through cracks nightly. Sleep remains uneven. Food, though filling, lacks certain fresh nutrients. Bodies work constantly. And still, people lived long enough to become grandparents telling stories beside fires just like this one. Human beings are remarkably stubborn. The man coughs once into his blanket, then grows still again. His breathing sounds heavier than earlier, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from smoke, perhaps from years of winters exactly like this one settling gradually inside his chest. No one comments on it. There are some discomforts so ordinary they become invisible. The youngest child whimpers faintly in sleep. The woman immediately hums a few quiet notes barely louder than breathing. No words, just rhythm. A soft human sound against the winter dark. The child settles again almost instantly. That small moment changes the room. Suddenly the cabin feels less like a battlefield against cold and more like a shelter held together by care. Smoke and draughts still exist. Illness still lurks. The fire still weakens. But someone is always checking the blankets. Someone is always listening for coughs. Someone keeps the kettle near the embers just in case. Perhaps survival here depends on tenderness as much as toughness. Outside, snow continues falling silently beyond the shutters. Inside the little cabin breathes its smoky air around sleeping bodies, while coughs fade, embers pulse softly beneath ash, and weary people carry one another carefully through another freezing winter night. The hands do not rest for long. Even in the deep cold of the night, even while most of the cabin sleeps, the woman's hands keep their own quiet watch. They emerge from beneath the blanket, feel for a child's cap, smooth a quilt edge, check the wrapped stone near small feet, then disappear again into warmth. You have seen those hands working all evening. They stirred supper, they mended stockings, they lifted kettles, they tested stones, they tucked bedding, they rubbed salve into cracked skin. They carried the invisible architecture of the household one small task at a time. Winter survival in this cabin is not only a story of axes, firewood, and men rising near the hearth. It is also a story of sewing, spinning, nursing, drying, saving, sorting, patching, counting, and remembering. Much of that work belongs to women, and much of it disappears from dramatic history, because nobody wrote grand poems about reheating a child's stockings at midnight. A solid truth from 18th century domestic life is that women's labour produced much of the warmth people relied on. Spinning wool, knitting stockings, sewing shifts, quilting covers, managing laundry, preserving food, tending children, nursing the sick, and keeping the hearth usable all shaped whether a family slept safely through winter. The cabin might be built from logs, but daily comfort was built from repeated domestic labour. The woman wakes fully now, though only for a minute. She listens. The coughs have quieted. The wind has softened. The embers still live. She sits up carefully, wraps a shawl around herself, and reaches toward the stockings hanging near the hearth. One pair is still damp at the toes. She turns them, that is all. Just turns them so the damp side faces the warmth. Then she lies down again. No speech, no ceremony, no applause from civilization, just one tiny act that may keep a child's feet warmer in the morning. You feel the weight of it. The cabin's survival depends on things like this. A small domestic oddity from the period involved keeping scraps of worn wool and linen for future patching stuffing, wiping binding or padding. A garment rarely had one life. It might begin as clothing become bedding patch, become bandage, become cleaning rag, and finally become tinder. Fabric descended through usefulness like a very tired aristocrat losing titles. You look around and see evidence everywhere. A sleeve patched into a quilt, cloth stuffed in a wool crack, a torn shirt remade into a child's wrap, a strip tied around the man's wrist. Nothing truly leaves the household until it has given nearly everything. Women often manage that transformation. They knew which blanket was thinning, which child had outgrown which garment, which scrap could mend a mitten, which sheet had enough strong cloth left for another winter, which food store was low, which cough sounded ordinary and which sounded worrying. Their knowledge lived in touch, habit, and memory. Researchers continue to question how best to measure women's winter labour in colonial households, because so much of it was repetitive, unpaid, and mentioned only indirectly in surviving records. Account books might list cloth purchases, probate inventories might list spinning wheels, diaries might note mended or washed in a single word. But the hours behind those words stretch long and cold. The woman's hands prove what the records flatten. She shifts again, smoothing the blanket between two children so no draft slips under the edge. One child sighs and relaxes. That small sound is her reward. Not enough, perhaps, but real. The man near the hearth is asleep again, and his labour is visible in the woodpile and axe scars on the logs. Hers is quieter, woven into every soft thing in the room. The bedding, the clothing, the stored food, the warm broth, the dried herbs, the mended stockings, the carefully placed stones, the children who remain covered through the night. A cabin can be built in a season. A household is maintained every hour. You notice a spinning wheel near the wall, partly hidden in shadow. During long winter evenings, women and girls often spun flax or wool beside the fire, turning raw fibre into thread. It was slow work, repetitive enough to become almost musical. The wheel's soft whir would have joined the crackle of fire and the murmur of voices. Tonight it is silent, but its presence matters. Thread becomes cloth. Cloth becomes clothing. Clothing becomes warmth. Warmth becomes sleep. There is a whole economy inside that wheel, a curious belief among some rural women, held that spinning or sewing certain garments under particular moon phases could affect luck, durability, or protection. It is difficult to know how widely such ideas were taken seriously, but household craft and folk belief often lived comfortably side by side. When you have spent hours making one pair of stockings, you may be forgiven for wanting the moon to cooperate. The wind returns softly. The old blanket by the door sways. The woman hears it and opens her eyes again. For a moment you think she will rise, but she only watches. The draught is not stronger than before. The children remain covered. The fire has enough glow. She closes her eyes. This is decision-making in darkness. Rise or save warmth. Use wood or conserve it. Wake the child or let sleep hold. Dry stockings now or later. Every choice is small, but winter collects small choices. You begin to see how emotional labour lives here too. Someone must worry ahead. Count blankets. Notice illness. Remember food. Plan washing for days when water can be heated. Keep children near enough to warmth without letting them tumble toward flame. Calm fears when wind sounds like footsteps outside. The cabin's mood depends on that unseen work. A frightened child cannot sleep. A sick child must be soothed. A tired man must eat. A visitor must be placed somewhere. A baby must be kept warm without smothering. A household must remain orderly enough that everyone can face morning. No wonder her rest is thin. No wonder her hands keep moving. You sit in the smoky hush and feel the whole room differently now. Earlier the cabin seemed held together by logs and fire. Now you understand it's also held together by women's memory, by knowing where the dry cloth is, by saving herbs, by patching before tearing becomes ruin, by waking before the child grows too cold. The embers pulse once beneath ash. The light touches her face briefly, tired, calm. Younger than her labour makes her seem, older than her years perhaps. Winter does that. Responsibility does that too. Outside, snow continues to fall without knowing who turned the stockings, who stitched the quilt, who rubbed warmth back into a child's hands, who counted the remaining meal, who made sleep possible for everyone else. Inside, the woman's hands grow still at last beneath the blanket. For now, the cabin breathes around her careful work, and the long freezing night rests on all the quiet things she has already done. The smallest sleepers require the most attention. You notice that before anything else tonight. The blankets nearest the children are thicker. The warm stones are placed carefully by little feet. The woman's arm curves protectively around the youngest child, even in sleep, as if her body refuses to forget its assignment for even a moment. Children lose warmth quickly. Everyone in this cabin knows it. The youngest child stirs beneath the quilt and makes a soft, unhappy sound. Not fear exactly. More the complaint of someone whose warm little pocket inside the blankets has shifted slightly colder. The woman wakes immediately again, though her eyes barely open. She tucks the child closer against her chest, pulls the blanket edge higher, and rests her chin lightly against the wool cap on the child's head. The small body relaxes at once. It feels astonishingly tender in the dim ember glow. A practical reality of 18th century family life was that infants and small children often slept near parents or siblings during winter for warmth and safety. Separate nurseries belonged mostly to wealthier households. In ordinary cabins, children slept where heat, supervision and available space allowed. Shared bedding was common not only from necessity, but because warmth itself could be life-saving during severe cold. The youngest child's cheeks are pink from trapped heat beneath the covers. Tiny curls of breath escape near the blanket edge. One mitten has slipped partly off during sleep, exposing little fingers to the cold air. The woman notices instantly. Of course she does. She pulls the mitten back on without fully waking. You suspect mothers develop supernatural senses sometime around the third sleepless winter. A fascinating little detail from some colonial diaries describes children sleeping in long gown-like garments called night rails, or shifts, often layered with stockings, caps and extra wrapping cloths during cold weather. Tiny bodies were bundled carefully, because once chilled, warming them again could be difficult in cabins where firewood and heated water were limited. The older boy downstairs mutters in sleep and drags part of the blanket away accidentally. Immediately the youngest child loses some shared warmth and squirms again. Everything in the bed affects everything else. One blanket shifts and three bodies notice. You see now why nighttime in these cabins involved constant tiny adjustments, pulling fabric, turning children inward, sharing heat, repositioning stones, listening for coughs. Sleep becomes choreography. The dog lifts its head, briefly notices no one is dying and returns to dreaming with admirable professionalism. Overhead, the loft creaks softly as the older boy changes position. Loft sleeping may offer slightly warmer air, but children up there still face drifting smoke-rough boards and bitter draughts sneaking through roof seams. The cabin distributes discomfort creatively to all age groups. Some scholars continue discussing how colonial childhood differed emotionally from modern ideas of childhood, especially in frontier regions where work and survival responsibilities began early. Yet surviving letters and household records also reveal affection, worry, grief, playfulness, and tenderness surrounding children. Parents in 1773 loved their children deeply. They simply loved them in a world that demanded practical toughness alongside care. You can feel both things in this room, tenderness and toughness. The woman's hands are gentle, but the blankets are rough wool. The children sleep close for comfort, but also because cold demands it. The little cap covering the youngest child's ears looks handmade and slightly crooked, probably repaired several times already. A small wooden cradle sits near the wall, empty tonight. Perhaps the youngest child once slept there. Perhaps another baby did. Cradles in winter cabins were often placed near the hearth, though not too near. Heat could help an infant sleep, but sparks and smoke created dangers of their own. Everything required balance. Too cold, too warm, too close to the fire, too near the draught. Parents navigated these choices constantly with experience, instead of instructions printed beside adorable cartoon diagrams. One unusual folk practice from some communities involved placing warmed flannel or heated cloth around a child's chest during winter illness or bitter weather. Another suggested rubbing goose grease on feet or chest to help protect against cold air. Whether medically effective or not, such remedies reveal how desperately people sought ways to guard vulnerable bodies through harsh seasons. The embers brighten slightly as a hidden coal shifts beneath ash. Orange light spills briefly across the children's faces. You notice how small they truly are inside this rough cabin. Tiny sleeping creatures wrapped in patched quilts while an entire winter presses against the walls outside. It suddenly feels miraculous that so many families survived at all. And yet millions did. Children adapted early to cabin life. They learned where warmth gathered, how to hold hands near embers without burning themselves, how to share bedding, how to keep stockings dry, how to move carefully across freezing floors at night. Winter taught them through repetition, perhaps too early sometimes. The older boy downstairs coughs once and pulls the blanket over his nose. Even sleeping, he curls protectively around his own warmth like an adult already. Childhood and responsibility overlap heavily here. You think about modern bedrooms filled with soft toys, glowing nightlights, shelves of books, and carefully controlled temperatures. Then you look around this cabin. Smoke-stained beams, one crowded bed, frost at the door, wet stockings drying by embers. Yet the emotional core feels strangely familiar. A parent checking blankets, a child reaching instinctively toward warmth, someone staying awake longer than they want because another person needs care. That part survives every century intact. The woman finally sleeps more deeply for a while. Her breathing slows. One child presses close against her side. Another has an arm thrown across the blankets toward the dog who accepts this responsibility nobly. Outside wind brushes softly against the shutters again. Inside the cabin smells of ash wool and sleeping children. You realize that children change the emotional temperature of the room almost as much as the fire does. Without them, the cabin might feel merely harsh and practical. With them, every blanket tucked tighter becomes meaningful. Every warmed stone matters. Every spoonful of stew carries urgency. Adults endure winter for themselves. Parents endure it for someone else too. The fire settles lower. The room darkens further. One tiny hand escapes the blanket again and rests against the woman's sleeve. She catches it immediately, even in sleep, folding it back into warmth, with a movement so practiced it seems older than language. The cabin creaks softly around them. Snow falls beyond the shutters, and the children sleep on wrapped in layers of wool breath care and exhausted love while the freezing night keeps watch outside the little wooden walls. The cabin is not entirely European. You begin to sense that slowly in little details scattered through the room. The packed moss in the wall seams, the arrangement of hides near the doorway, the way certain herbs hang drying overhead, the practical understanding of winter itself. Much of what settlers survived with in places like this came not from Europe, but from adaptation after arrival. And many of those adaptations emerged through contact observation trade or outright borrowing from indigenous peoples who had lived through North American winters for generations beyond counting. The snow outside deepens quietly against the cabin walls while you think about that. Long before this little structure stood here breathing smoke into the frozen air, other peoples understood how to move through these winters. Which furs held warmth best, which foods preserved well, which shelter shapes resisted wind, which plants eased sickness, which trails remained passable after storms. Some settlers learned carefully. Others ignored excellent advice with a confidence unique to cold newcomers. The results were predictable. Historical records from colonial America show that European settlers often adopted indigenous knowledge related to winter survival, including the use of snowshoes, certain food preservation methods, fur garments, medicinal plants, and regional building techniques. Survival frequently depended on adapting quickly to climates far harsher than many newcomers expected. North America had a habit of correcting unrealistic optimism rather aggressively. You look at the heavy fur draped near the door, deerskin perhaps, softened through scraping, smoking, and labour. It blocks drafts more effectively than plain cloth alone. Fur mittens, moccasins, leggings, and winter wraps used across indigenous communities influenced colonial winter clothing in many frontier regions because they worked. That last part mattered most. Winter has little patience for pride. The man near the hearth shifts beneath his blanket, one boot sticking partly toward the embers for warmth. His outer coat hanging nearby appears pieced together from woven wool and animal hide. A practical mixture. The sort of thing born from necessity rather than fashion, although fashion always tries to arrive eventually even in frozen forests. You imagine some exhausted settler insisting his frostbitten toes remain culturally superior while borrowing moccasin designs from people who actually understood the terrain. History contains many such moments. A lesser-known custom in some frontier settlements involved trading for indigenous-made snowshoes during severe winters, because European footwear alone often failed badly in deep snow. Snowshoes transformed winter travel from exhausting disaster into merely difficult misery, which counts as progress in 18th century terms. Overhead the loft creaks gently. Below the children remain bundled together beneath quilts. The youngest child has one cheek pressed against the woman's shoulder, now sleeping with complete trust despite the cold. You notice again how carefully the family manages heat through bodies, fabric, and shelter. Indigenous winter traditions across different regions often emphasize similar principles, though expressed through different housing styles and materials. Heat conservation, layered covering, shared sleeping arrangements, and controlled fire use appear again and again wherever humans survive brutal winters. Cold teaches universally, but not every culture answered it the same way. Some scholars continue discussing how much colonial survival narratives understate indigenous contributions, because many European accounts framed borrowed knowledge as discoveries rather than adaptations learned from native communities. The written records often reveal more about colonial pride than about who first understood the land. The cabin itself reflects compromise. European-style walls, local timber, borrowed winter habits, improvised solutions. Nothing here belongs entirely to one tradition anymore. Smoke drifts softly toward the rafters again. The chimney pulls unevenly as wind shifts outside. You think about other winter shelters across the continent in 1773. Longhouses warmed by multiple fires, wigwams insulated with bark and mats, earth lodges holding steady temperatures through thick construction, structures shaped over centuries for specific climates. This little cabin, by comparison, still feels like an argument with the environment. A determined argument, certainly, but an argument. One curious detail recorded by some travellers was their surprise at how effectively indigenous fur clothing managed winter cold, compared to certain European garments. Beaver buffalo, rabbit deer, and other furs provided insulation difficult to match with woven cloth alone. Of course, European fashion occasionally looked at practical fur clothing and thought, interesting. But could it also be uncomfortable and decorative? Civilization remains committed to strange priorities. The dog snores louder now beside the hearth, utterly unconcerned with cultural exchange. Smart animal. You notice the children's blankets include pieces of hide stitched beneath worn wool sections. Extra warmth where fabric had thinned. Perhaps traded locally. Perhaps prepared by the family. Either way, survival rarely cares about purity of tradition. Useful ideas travel quickly through cold places, Outside, wind brushes snow against the shutters with a soft dry sound. The room smells heavily now of smoke wool and sleeping bodies. Yet beneath it all you catch another scent occasionally. Tanned hide, rich and earthy. It lingers near the doorway and the hanging garments, a smell older than the cabin itself. The man coughs once in his sleep and turns closer toward the hearth. His hand rests near the poker automatically. Even sleeping part of him remains ready for the fire. You think about how settlers arriving from different parts of Europe must have confronted these winters with wildly different expectations. Some knew cold already, others did not. Some adapted quickly, others clung stubbornly to habits poorly suited for frontier conditions. Winter rewarded flexibility. People who learned survived more comfortably than those who insisted the land behave differently. Researchers examining early frontier communities still disagree about how quickly winter adaptation occurred across various settlements, because experiences differed enormously by region, contact with native groups, available resources, and sheer luck. Some families entered winter with strong local guidance. Others stumbled through by trial and error. Trial and error is a stressful educational system when frostbite participates. The embers brighten briefly beneath settling ash. Light flicker across the wall seams stuffed with moss. You wonder who first showed settlers that trick here. Perhaps nobody specifically. Perhaps several traditions met and blended slowly over years. Human beings are good at exchanging survival knowledge even while disagreeing about nearly everything else. The youngest child stirs and pulls the blanket higher around their face. The woman adjusts it gently without waking fully. Again that small act of protection. Again that quiet expertise. Outside, snow keeps falling onto forests that held winter wisdom long before colonial cabins appeared among the trees. Inside, the family sleeps wrapped in wool fur smoke and borrowed knowledge from many directions, while the little wooden shelter continues its imperfect but determined work against the endless cold of the American night. Dawn does not arrive warmly. It arrives as a pale thinning of darkness near the shutter cracks a grey suggestion rather than a promise. The cabin remains cold enough that your breath shows in front of you. The fire has sunk almost completely beneath ash. The room smells of sleep smoke, damp wool, and the faint sourness of long-closed air. Nobody wakes refreshed. That is the first thing you notice. They wake because the day requires them. The man near the hearth opens his eyes before anyone else. For a few moments he lies still listening. The old habit again. Roof, wind, children, dog, fire. He lifts one hand from beneath the blanket, feels the air and seems to regret civilization entirely. Then he rises, slowly, carefully. His stockinged feet touch the floor and his whole body tightens. The packed earth has become a slab of winter during the night. Even through wool the cold bites upward. He reaches for his boots, then pauses because boots left near the door can stiffen overnight until putting them on becomes a small personal tragedy. Fortunately, these were kept near the hearth. A practical detail in many cold households was keeping shoes, boots and outer garments close enough to the fire to prevent freezing solid, but not so close that sparks damage them. Leather stiffened badly in winter, especially when damp. Morning routines often began with thawing footwear, shaking out bedding and reviving embers before anyone could properly face the day. The man kneels by the hearth. He takes the poker and gently searches beneath the ash. For one suspenseful moment nothing happens. Then a coal glows red. Tiny, deep, alive. The room has been saved by something no larger than a walnut. He bends low and feeds it dry tinder. A twist of bark. A shaving of wood. Perhaps a little tow or dried grass kept for this exact purpose. He breathes carefully onto the ember, not too hard, not too softly. Smoke rises first, then a spark, then a small flame catches and trembles. You feel absurdly relieved. The fire lives. Across the room the woman wakes as if pulled by that change alone. She sits up, cap askew, face pale with cold. Her first movement is not for herself. She checks the children. One blanket has slipped, but not badly. The youngest child is warm enough. The older boy near the wall looks stiff and miserable, but breathing steadily. Good morning 1773, you remain rude. A lesser-known mourning habit involved raking ashes carefully for useful remains. Wood ash could be saved for making lye, which helped produce soap. Ashes could also be spread in icy spots or used in cleaning. Even the remains of the night's fire had future work to do. Nothing in this cabin gets to retire gracefully, not even burnt wood. The woman pulls her shawl tighter and reaches for the stockings she turned during the night. They're dry now, or close enough. Close enough is an important colonial category. She hands them to a child still half asleep beneath quilts. The child resists leaving the bed. You understand completely. The bed is not luxurious, but it contains the last stored warmth of the night. Outside the blankets, the cabin waits like a cold pond. One child sits up and immediately makes the face of someone discovering betrayal. The air has no mercy. The wool cap goes back on tighter. Arms disappear into sleeves. Stockings are tugged upward. A blanket remains around shoulders as long as possible. Some historians continue to examine whether winter mornings in small cabins caused more discomfort than the nights themselves, because waking meant abandoning shared warmth before the fire fully recovered. Surviving accounts often emphasize nighttime cold, but the first hour after rising may have been just as punishing. The dog wakes last, which feels unfair. It stretches extravagantly near the hearth, clearly having enjoyed one of the better sleeping arrangements. Then it shakes itself, filling the air with old fur ash dust and confidence. Outside, dawn grows brighter. The shutter cracks reveal blue-grey snow piled against the lower wall. Someone will need to clear the doorway soon. Someone will need to bring in more wood. Someone will need water. If the bucket inside has frozen around the rim, it must be thawed. If the animals are waiting, they will not care that the humans slept poorly. Morning does not negotiate. The man feeds the fire more confidently now. Flames curl around kindling and begin licking at a split log. Heat enters the room in thin waves. You feel it against your face first. Your feet remain cold. Your back remains cold. The cabin warms from one small centre, outward slowly reclaiming the night's territory. The woman folds bedding back just enough to air dampness near the fire, though not enough to lose all warmth. Moisture from breath and bodies has settled into cloth overnight. If ignored, day after day, bedding becomes clammy, smoky and unhealthy. Winter housekeeping begins before breakfast. A strange household belief in some communities warned that dreams left behind in bedding should be shaken out in the morning, especially after illness or nightmares. Whether treated seriously or playfully, shaking blankets did remove dust, soot fleas and stale air, so perhaps superstition and hygiene accidentally shook hands. The older boy climbs down from the loft, hair flattened beneath his cap eyes red from smoke. He lands softly on the floor, then winces as cold reaches his feet. He moves toward the hearth without being told. Everyone moves toward the hearth. The room gathers again around flame, but now with urgency rather than sleepiness. Hands extend. Boots warm. A kettle is set closer. Someone breaks ice from a water pail with a dull tap. The sound feels unbearably ordinary. You glance around the cabin and see the night's evidence everywhere. Ash spread over the hearthstone. Blankets twisted from restless bodies. Frost still silver along the window edge. The threshold cloth stiff near the door. A wet patch where snow melted from boots. The warm stones now cool and useless beneath the bedding. The room looks less like a cosy shelter and more like a battlefield after a very quiet siege. Yet the family is one. Not dramatically. No trumpets. No heroic speeches. Just breathing, people waking children, a living coal, and another day beginning. That is victory here. Outside, the world remains frozen. The trees stand heavy with snow. Smoke begins rising again from the chimney, stronger now, making a dark ribbon against the pale morning sky. Somewhere beyond the clearing, another cabin may be waking in the same slow way. Another family stirring embers. Another child refusing the cold floor. Another dog claiming credit for survival. You stand near the hearth as the first true light enters through the cracks, watching numb fingers uncurl, stiff shoes soften, and the fragile warmth of morning begin again from ash. The cabin remembers the night even after daylight enters. You see it in the ash. You see it in the frost fading slowly from the window edge. You see it in the blankets still shaped like sleeping bodies, in the stiff stockings warming near the hearth, in the little wrapped stones now dull and cold at the foot of the bed. Nothing dramatic remains. That is the remarkable thing. A whole freezing night has passed through this room, pressing against walls, slipping under the door, testing the roof, thinning the fire, filling corners with frost, and now morning reduces it to traces. A smoky smell, a damp quilt, a child rubbing red hands near the flame, a man checking the woodpile with quiet concern, a woman shaking bedding once before folding it back into usefulness. Survival often looks very ordinary after it happens. In 1773, thousands of families across colonial America faced winter nights, with no central heating, no insulated glass, no electric light, and no easy medical help nearby. They relied on hearths, layers, shared bedding, stored food, local knowledge, and constant household labour. Their success was not usually heroic in the grand historical sense. It was repetitive, practical, and deeply physical. You stand near the door as the man lifts the latch. Cold morning air enters sharply, bright and clean compared with the smoky room. Everyone reacts a little. Shoulders rise, faces turn away. The dog slips out first, suddenly enthusiastic about a world it had wisely ignored all night. Snow lies thick across the clearing. The cabin roof holds a white weight along its edges. Smoke climbs steadily from the chimney, now no longer a fragile thread but a confident column. Dawn has fully arrived, though the sun remains hidden behind pale clouds. The man steps outside with an armload of yesterday's ash to scatter near the path where ice has formed. His boots crunch through crusted snow. The sound is crisp, almost satisfying. Behind him, the woman begins turning the room back from sleeping place into working place. Beds become storage. Blankets become airing cloth. The hearth becomes kitchen. The cabin transforms again because it must. One small but telling practice in many households was saving useful ashes for soap-making, cleaning icy paths, or garden use. Even the grey remains of last night's fire could return to work. The 18th century was very firm about everyone and everything having a job. You watch the children gather near breakfast warmth. Their faces are still sleepy. The youngest sits wrapped in a blanket, hair crushed beneath a crooked cap. The older boy from the loft rubs his eyes, leaving a faint smear of soot across one cheek. Nobody tells him immediately. Perhaps soot is simply part of the morning uniform. Breakfast will be simple. Porridge leftovers, warmed broth, maybe bread if there is bread. Food must rekindle bodies just as tinder rekindles flame. The day begins by feeding every fire. A continuing question among historians is how much nostalgia later Americans attached to the colonial hearth, after the fact turning smoky, difficult rooms into symbols of wholesome simplicity. The image of family gathered beside the fire became powerful, but the reality included aching backs, irritated lungs, cracked skin, uneven heat, and endless maintenance. Memory often polishes ash until it looks golden, and yet after spending this night here, you understand the nostalgia a little. Not because it was easy, because it was intimate. Every comfort depended on someone. The quilt existed because hands made it. The fire lasted because someone tended it. The child stayed warm because someone woke. The room held because someone chinked the walls. The breakfast warmed because one coal survived. Modern comfort is generous but often anonymous. Heat comes through vents. Water arrives through pipes. Light appears with a switch. You do not know who made the system possible moment by moment. Here comfort has faces. Tired faces, yes, smoky faces, slightly annoyed faces, but faces. You step back inside and let the door close behind you. The room seems warmer now, though still cold by any modern standard. The flames have grown. The kettle begins to murmur. Steam rises faintly, carrying the smell of meal and smoke. The woman lifts the youngest child onto a stool nearer the hearth. The dog returns covered in snow and is immediately told without words that shaking itself indoors would be a poor decision. The dog considers this and compromises by shaking only halfway. A bold diplomat. The family continues. That is the story. They do not conquer winter. They do not defeat it. They live beside it, bargain with it, patch against it, sleep through it, wake from it, and begin again. Outside, the forest remains immense. More nights will come, more cold, more smoke, more coughing, more damp stockings, more waking before dawn to search ash for one hidden coal. The work never truly ends. But neither does the skill. These people know how to survive in ways that seem almost invisible at first glance. How to bank a fire, how to dry wool, how to share heat without words, how to judge weather by wind sound, how to turn a cabin from workshop to bedroom and back again, how to make a small wooden room hold life through hours when the outside world could easily take it. You look once more at the hearth. The last ember of the night is no longer alone. It has become flame again. That feels like the right image to keep. Not a roaring blaze, not perfect warmth, just a coal preserved carefully enough to begin again in the morning. The cabin breathes around it. Smoke rises, children eat, boots thaw, blankets dry. The day gathers itself from what the night left behind. And you standing quietly in this winter morning of 1773 finally understand how people slept through freezing nights without heat as you know it. They did not sleep through comfort. They slept through discipline, exhaustion, layers, labour, closeness, and trust. They slept because the household worked together, because fire was guarded like treasure, because cloth was precious, because food mattered, because everybody gave warmth to another. They slept lightly. They slept cold. But they slept. And when dawn came, they rose from smoke-scented blankets, found the coal beneath ash, and made warmth again. Now the room grows softer. The hard edge of night loosens from the corners. The window frost thins into droplets. The air still carries smoke, but beneath it comes porridge wool, warm wood, and the faint, clean scent of snow brought in on boots. The children grow quieter as breakfast fills them. The woman's hands slow for a moment around her cup. The man stands beside the hearth, watching the flame with the calm of someone who has earned that small orange light. You let yourself step backward from the cabin without leaving it entirely. The scene remains, but it softens. The door, the bed, the rafters, the smoky beams, the little wrapped stones, the quilts patched from older lives. All of it drifts gently into memory. The cold no longer bites. It becomes only atmosphere. The wind no longer threatens. It becomes a low whisper in the trees. And now for you there is no need to rise before dawn, no need to chop wood, no need to test the ash for coals with stiff hands. You may simply rest beside the image of that small hearth, where one ember survived the longest part of the night and became morning. Let the cabin grow dimmer now. Let the snow fall without urgency. Let the sleepers of 1773 continue their day somewhere far behind you, strong and tired and wrapped in smoke-coloured light. And let your own room be warm, quiet and safe as the last ember fades into a soft glow, then a softer one, then almost nothing at all. Sweet dreams.